How are you?
Not bad. Had a good break.
Yeah, went to Kabul.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, they said you were just before there. Yeah, that's good.
I thought Donnie and those guys, you know, he's certainly a vast improvement over the other guys.
Well, good morning. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets today as soon as the media allows us to see the witnesses. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets today to receive testimony on the U.S. strategy to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. I'm grateful to our distinguished witnesses for appearing before us today. The risk posed by ISIL must be seen in the context of what many of America's most accomplished leaders and foreign policy experts have described as the most complex and uncertain international environment since the end of World War II. All across the globe, America's interests in security and stability are at risk. As part of a broader strategy to dominate Eastern Europe, Vladimir Putin's Russia continues its onslaught in Ukraine, with Russian troops and equipment leading an asymmetric campaign to undermine Ukraine's government and independence, as the United States has refused the Ukrainians weapons for its defense. China's destabilizing behavior also poses a growing challenge to U.S. national interest. Its reclamation and militarization of vast land features in the South China Sea, its continued military build-up, and of course, its blatant and undeterred cyber attacks against the United States. Iran is expanding its malign activities and hegemonic ambitions across the Middle East, as we see clearly in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and elsewhere, and yet some in the administration seem to operate under the delusion that a nuclear agreement could lead to a new modus vivendi with the Islamic Republic. And in Syria, Bashar Assad's slaughter of his own people, which has been the single greatest contributor to the rise and continued success of ISIL, goes on and on and on, aided by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. For 4 years, the president has said Assad must go as a part of a political transition in Syria, but conditions on the ground have never allowed it. Tragically, that remains true today. What each of these growing threats has in common is a failure of deterrence brought on by a dangerous perception of American weakness and lack of resolve, which our adversaries have taken as a provocative invitation for hostility. When it comes to ISIL, President Obama's comments yesterday at the Pentagon reveal the disturbing degree of self-delusion that characterizes the administration's thinking. It is right, but ultimately irrelevant, to point out, as the president did, that we have conducted thousands of airstrikes, taken out many ISIL fighters and much equipment, and pushed it out of some territory. None of the so-called progress that the president cited suggests that we are on a path to success. Since U.S. and coalition airstrikes began last year, ISIL has continued to enjoy battlefield successes, including taking Ramadi and other key terrain in Iraq, holding over half the territory in Syria and controlling every border post between Iraq and Syria. Moreover, the longer ISIL remains undefeated in Iraq and Syria, the more potent its message is to those around the world who may be radicalized and inspired to join the group and spread violence and mayhem on its behalf. It's not that we're doing nothing. It's that there is no compelling reason to believe that anything we are doing currently will be sufficient to achieve the president's long-stated goal of degrading and ultimately destroying ISIL, either in the short term or the long term. Our means and our current level of effort are not aligned with our ends. That suggests we are not winning, and when you're not winning in war, you are losing. The reality today is that ISIL continues to gain territory in Iraq and Syria while expanding its influence and presence across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. There is no responsible ground force in either Iraq or Syria that is both willing and able to take territory away from ISIL and hold it. And none of our current training efforts of moderate Syrian, Sunni tribes, or Iraqi security forces are as yet capable of producing such a ground force. It is unclear why the latest gradual escalation of effort, the deployment of a few hundred additional advisors to Anbar, will make the difference that our previous efforts failed to achieve. While our coalition may own the skies, as the President said yesterday, our air campaign against ISIL continues to be limited significantly by overly restrictive rules of engagement and a lack of ground intelligence, which only gets worse as ISIL moves into urban areas to avoid coalition bombing. Any pilot will tell you that they're only as good as the targets they receive, and when 3/4 of our air missions against ISIL still return to base without dropping weapons, that is indicative of a fundamental problem with our air campaign. What's worse, none of our efforts against ISIL in Iraq can succeed while the conflict in Syria continues, and with it the conditions for ISIL's continued growth, recruitment, and radicalization of Muslims around the world. As published media reports indicate, our Syria Train and Equip program is anemic and struggling because our stated goal does not include going after Assad and his regime forces, and we still do not provide the forces we're training with the enabling capabilities to succeed in any engagement they may face inside Syria. Given the poor numbers of recruited and trained Syrian fighters thus far, I am doubtful we can achieve our goal of training a few thousand this year. But even if the program achieves its goal, it is doubtful it will make a strategic difference on the battlefield. Yes, we need a political solution in Syria, but no such solution is possible with Bashar Assad still in power. Unless and until the United States leads a coalition effort to put far greater battlefield pressure on Assad, a political solution will never be within reach, the conflict will grind on, and ISIL will thrive. The lack of a coherent strategy has resulted in the spread of ISIL around the world, to Libya, Egypt, Nigeria, and even to Afghanistan, where I visited last weekend. Afghanistan is certainly not Iraq, but the parallels are eerily familiar. As in Iraq, the United States is contemplating a drastic reduction in force presence that places at risk the hard-won gains of the last decade. While Afghanistan's security forces are improving in quality, they're still missing the same set of key capabilities the Iraqis were missing when the U.S. withdrew in 2011, including intelligence, aviation, special operations, and logistic capabilities. At the current pace, our military commanders know these capabilities will remain critically undeveloped at the end of 2016, when President Obama has announced that U.S. and coalition forces will dramatically downsize to a presence solely in Kabul. We have seen this movie before, and if we make the same mistakes, we should expect similarly tragic results. I do not want to attend another hearing like this with your successors trying to figure out a strategy to clean up after avoidable mistakes. What that means is that the President must provide our commanders on the ground with necessary forces, capabilities, and the authorities to help our Afghan partners in continuing to secure their country and defeat our terrorist enemies together. ISIL is not 10 feet tall. It can be and must be defeated. But that will never happen if we continue to delude ourselves about our current campaign. The President is fond of the truism that there is no military solution to ISIL or any other problem. What he has so often failed to realize is that there is sometimes a major military dimension to achieving a political solution. This was the critical lesson that the United States learned in the Iraq surge, and we must learn again. Security on the ground is a precondition to political reconciliation, not the other way around. The unfortunate irony is that a president elected in opposition to the war in Iraq is repeating some of its worst strategic mistakes. And what's worse, despite obvious indication that the current strategy against ISIL is failing, he has yet to find the courage of his predecessor to admit mistakes and choose a new direction. This needs to happen sooner rather than later, or the disaster the next president will inherit in the Middle East, but also far beyond it, will be overwhelming. It is clear we are living in a time of unprecedented turmoil. We see it on our television screens every day. ISIL spread across the Middle East, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and China's maritime expansion in Asia. Once again, I thank our witnesses and look forward to their testimony. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Carter, General Dempsey. Thank you. This morning's hearing is an important opportunity for this committee to hear from the administration regarding its strategy to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. It follows up on the committee's hearings in May, which outside witnesses regarding the counter-ISIL strategy. ISIL, with its violent extremist ideology and brutal military capabilities, poses a clear threat to the stability of the Middle East, Africa, and beyond, and a threat to the United States and our partners' interests in those regions and indeed even in the homeland. ISIL's campaign to establish a caliphate threatens to create a breeding ground for training extremist fighters, attracting foreign fighters intent on returning to Western countries to carry out attacks, and inspiring others in the United States and elsewhere to commit violence. The American people recognize the threat posed by ISIL, but at the same time are appropriately wary, after nearly a decade and a half of U.S. military involvement overseas, about being drawn deeper into a seemingly intractable Middle East conflict. As part of the administration's whole-of-government strategy, the Department of Defense has the lead for 2 of the 9 lines of effort against ISIL and plays a supporting role for the efforts of a number of other departments and agencies. This committee has provided essential resources to the department to implement the strategy through funding of the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, including the President's request for both the Iraq and Syria Train and Equip Funds and $1 billion for the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund. However, the severe cuts mandated by sequestration puts at risk the ability of the civilian departments of our government, including the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Aid, Development, and the Department of Homeland Security and Treasury Department to carry out fully the other 7 lines of effort that comprise our counter-ISIL strategy. The effect of sequestration could be that the U.S. government is having to fight ISIL literally with one hand tied behind its back. The success of the strategy depends on getting both our military and civilian departments the necessary resources to confront ISIL. At this committee's hearing in May, several witnesses called for expanding the U.S. military involvement in Iraq and Syria in response to ISIL's seizure of the Anbar provincial capital of Ramadi and ISIL's gains in Syria. The President's announcement last month of an additional 450 U.S. troops to be deployed to Iraq to train and assist Iraqi security forces begins to address the critical need to bring local Sunni tribes into the fight against ISIL. We will be interested in hearing from our witnesses what additional steps they would recommend for expanding the presence of Sunni fighters in the Iraqi security forces and to ensure that Kurdish Peshmergas receive expeditiously the weapons they need to counter ISIL in the fight. In many respects, the current challenges in Iraq result from 2 intersecting forces: the rise of ISIL and the deterioration of the Iraqi security forces and complementary governmental capacities. Many of the factors and personalities forming ISIL can be traced to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Planning for that war failed to account for deep-seated sectarian divisions between Sunni and Shia within the region, which gave rise to grievances that fueled the rise of ISIL. In addition, many of the factors contributing to the deterioration of Iraq's security forces can be traced to the actions of Prime Minister Maliki, in particular his replacement of competent leaders in the military with cronies loyal to himself. Iran's role in Iraq and the broader region must never be forgotten either. Many of the aforementioned actions by Maliki were at the behest of Iran, or certainly with their acquiescence. And Iran's influence on Iraq's political decision-making can be seen even prior to the 2008 visit of the Iranian President Ahmadinejad to Baghdad. Today, Iran has its own military boots on the ground in both Iraq and Syria, and it continues to support its proxies. We must keep a close eye on Iran and assess carefully their interests at the tactical and strategic level. As we work with the coalition to counter the threat of ISIL, it will be useful to obtain your perspective on these and other factors as we endeavor to reshape our policies and our strategy. Ultimately, though, one of the key lessons from the Iraq War is that no amount of U.S. or coalition military assistance or boots on the ground will lead to the lasting defeat of violent extremism if the underlying political causes that allow such extremism to arise and thrive are not addressed. In Iraq, the Abadi government must continue to take substantive steps to govern in a more inclusive manner, address longstanding grievances of Iraq's sectarian and ethnic minorities, expand the integration of Sunnis and Kurds into Iraq's military and political structures, and disarm Iranian-backed Shia militias. In Syria, moderate and extreme elements of the opposition have made tactical gains against ISIL and the regime, but ISIL remains the dominant force in western Syria. Absent a moderate opposition that is willing to and capable of taking territory from ISIL and holding it, any change in the status quo is unlikely. Boasted by critical outside assistance, the Assad regime remains in the seat of power in Damascus, but has ceded territory in recent months. Despite these territorial shifts in the ground battle in Syria, a defeat on the battlefield is not the most likely end to the battle in Syria. A political solution that addresses grievances in a broad range of constituencies in Syria is the only pathway to a sustainable solution. When I met with military and political leaders in Iraq earlier this year, they emphasized that U.S. and coalition forces are at the beginning of a multi-year campaign against ISIL. They stressed the need for strategic patience. I hope our witnesses today will provide their perspectives on just where we are in the long fight and what to expect in the coming months and years ahead, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I welcome the witnesses. Secretary Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you to address your questions and concerns about this campaign. And I want to especially thank the chairman for going to Afghanistan over his 4th of July weekend, which I appreciate. Visiting the troops means a lot to us, sir. And as all of you know from your travels around the world, there's a high demand everywhere in the world for American leadership. From Asia, where I saw some of you in May, to Europe, where I was 2 weeks ago. The Obama administration and the members of this committee have helped ensure that we meet that demand, and I thank you for that. Same is true in the Middle East, where we're standing by our friends like Israel, working to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and otherwise exercising malign influence, and confronting ISIL, which is the subject of this hearing. It was also the subject of a meeting yesterday at the Pentagon where President Obama and Chairman Dempsey and I discussed our counter-ISIL campaign with senior defense and interagency leaders. We all agreed that ISIL represents a grave threat and that it must be and will be dealt a lasting defeat. That's our objective, which is shared by a global coalition that reflects both the worldwide consensus on the need to counter ISIL and the practical requirement for others to do their part. The administration's strategy to achieve that objective, as the Joint Chiefs' doctrinal definition of strategy puts it, integrates all the nation's strengths and instruments of power, as has been noted. And it's executed through 9 synchronized lines of effort. The first, and arguably the most critical line of effort, is the political one, as has also been noted, which is led by the State Department. This line involves building more effective, inclusive, and multi-sectarian governance in Iraq. At the same time, the United States continues to work diplomatically to bring about a political transition from Bashar al-Assad to a more inclusive government with which we can also work to defeat ISIL. The next 2 lines of effort are interconnected: to deny ISIL safe haven and to build partner capacity in Iraq and Syria. Both are led by the Department of Defense, which alongside coalition partners is conducting an air campaign, advising and assisting Iraqi security forces on the ground, and training and equipping vetted local forces in Iraq and for Syria. Before I go on, let me say that these first 3 political and military lines of effort have to be in sync, a point that's been made already. That's a challenge, but one we're working through with our partners in the coalition on the ground and around our government. The 4th line of effort is enhancing intelligence collection on ISIL, which is led by the National Counterterrorism Center. The 5th line of effort, disrupting ISIL's finances, is co-led by Treasury and State. Lines of Effort 6 and 7, both co-led by State and the National Counterterrorism Center, are to counter ISIL's messaging and disrupt the flow of foreign fighters to and from ISIL, both of which are critical in today's connected and networked world. The 8th line of effort, providing humanitarian support to those affected by the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, is led by State and AID. Finally, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the Department of Justice work together to protect the homeland, the 9th line of effort, by disrupting terrorist threats. In addition to our full-spectrum cooperative relationship with the Department of Homeland Security and other law enforcement agencies, DoD personnel continue to strike ISIL elements in Iraq and Syria. The effective execution of all 9 lines of effort by the United States and its coalition partners is necessary to ensure ISIL's lasting defeat. I want to add briefly that there are important classified dimensions to our approach to ISIL and to the Middle East more broadly, Mr. Chairman, that we won't be able to discuss in this meeting, but can discuss separately. Let me turn to the execution of the 2 lines of effort on which DoD leads, which our personnel have been performing with the excellence we all expect of the finest fighting force the world has ever known. American service members and their coalition partners have conducted over 5,000 airstrikes. That air campaign has produced some clear tactical results, limiting ISIL's freedom of movement, constraining its ability to reinforce its fighters, and degrading its command and control. Coalition air support has also enabled gains by local forces in Iraq and Syria, including Syrian, Kurdish, and Arab forces who recently took the key border town of Tal Abyad from ISIL, cut off one of its key lines of communication and supply, and put ISIL on the defensive and its stronghold Raqqa under pressure. Those examples demonstrate again that where we have a credible ground force working in a coordinated way with the coalition air campaign, ISIL has suffered. That's what makes the 3rd line of effort, developing the capacity and capabilities of local forces, so important. Indeed, we know from recent experience that success against ISIL requires capable local ground forces. And we know from our history in the region that putting U.S. combat troops on the ground as a substitute for local forces will not produce enduring results. That's why we're bolstering Iraq's security forces and building moderate, vetted Syrian opposition forces. But both of these efforts need strengthening. In Iraq, the Iraqi security forces were severely degraded after 4 divisions dissolved and Mosul fell a year ago this June. Our efforts to build partner capacity and advise and assist ongoing operations involve around 3,550 American personnel at 6 locations around the country. Their training work has been slowed, however, by a lack of trainees. As of June 30th, we've only received enough trainees to be able to train about 8,800 Iraqi Army soldiers and Peshmerga forces, in addition to some 2,000 CTS personnel. Another 4,000 soldiers, including 600 CTS personnel, are in training. I've told Iraqi leaders that while the United States is open to supporting Iraq more than we already are, we must also see greater commitment from all parts of the Iraqi government. We're also in the early stages of our train and equip mission in Syria. 3 months into our program, training is underway, and we are working to screen and vet almost 7,000 volunteers to ensure that they are committed to fighting ISIL, pass a counterintelligence screening, and meet standards prescribed by U.S. law regarding the law of armed conflict and necessitated by operations. As of July 3rd, we are currently training about 60 fighters. This number is much smaller than we'd hoped for at this point, partly because of the vetting standards I just described. But we know this program's essential. We need a partner on the ground in Syria to assure ISIL's lasting defeat. And as training progresses, we're learning more about the opposition groups and building important relationships, which increases our ability to attract recruits and provides valuable intelligence for counter-ISIL operations. We're also working to equip vetted local forces. In Iraq, after earlier delays, we're expediting delivery of essential equipment and materiel to the Iraqi security forces and working with the government of Iraq to ensure this equipment is quickly passed to Kurdish Peshmerga and Sunni tribal forces. In Syria, we'll begin equipping forces as soon as they complete training. We're constantly assessing this approach. We did so after the fall of Ramadi, continued through yesterday with President Obama at the Pentagon. The strategy is the right one, but its execution can and will be strengthened, especially on the ground. In Iraq, we're focused on increasing participation in and throughput of our training facilities. An example of this is our effort at Taqadum, which has been noted, in Anbar province, where we recently deployed approximately 350 of the additional 450 American personnel authorized. We assessed our presence at this military base would provide access to thousands of previously unreachable Sunni tribesmen. This is in support of the Iraqi government's own initiative to increase outreach to the Anbar tribes. As of mid-June, the Iraqi government has enrolled and armed an initial group of 800 Sunni fighters at Taqadum, and we're supporting the Iraqi training of 500 additional fighters now at Taqadum. The Iraqis have already identified 500 more trainees that will follow the current group, and we'll continue to work to ensure that these Sunni fighters, which are critical of the success of our campaign, have the training and equipment needed to effectively fight ISIL. I should also note that the Anbar Operations Center is located at Taqadum, which is another reason for that particular geography, so that we can advise and assist the Iraqi commanders there commanding Sunni forces. In Syria, we seek to capitalize on the recent successes in Kobani, Tal Abyad, and continue to strike ISIL's nerve center in Raqqa. At the same time, we're looking for ways to streamline our train and equip program's vetting process, which I noted earlier, to get more recruits into the training pipeline. We're also refining our curriculum, expanding our outreach to the moderate opposition, and incorporating lessons learned from the first training class. I'm happy to speak about that more. In conclusion, I sought to describe to you clearly the strategy, the Department of Defense's execution of its critical lines of effort, and where our execution can and will and must be strengthened. Achieving ISIL's lasting defeat will require continued commitment, steady leadership from the United States and our global coalition, hard work by our men and women in uniform, essential complementarity and synchronized efforts along the other 7 lines of effort, and most importantly, commitment and sacrifice by Iraqis and Syrians. Together, and with your continuing support for the men and women of the Department of Defense, for which we are ever grateful, we will achieve ISIL's lasting defeat. Thank you.
General Dempsey.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and to chat with you today about the military component of our strategy against ISIL. Our starting point has to be the strategic picture in context. I've said before that the global security environment is as uncertain as I've ever seen it. The world is rapidly changing everywhere, and we're seeing significant shifts in an already complex strategic landscape. ISIL is one of many concerns. As the chairman mentioned, we're contending with Russia's revanchism in Eastern Europe, China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, Iran's malign activities in the Middle East, technical advancements by North Korea, rising aggression of non-state networks, and a rapidly leveling playing field in cyber and in space. While our potential adversaries grow stronger, many of our allies are becoming increasingly dependent on the United States and on our assistance, and some of our comparative military advantages have begun to erode. What makes this uniquely complicated is that these trends are manifesting themselves simultaneously. Within the Middle East, I characterize 3 converging sets of complexity. First, several governments are struggling for political legitimacy because they're not sufficiently pluralistic or they're not sufficiently accountable to their citizens. Second, the centuries-old Sunni-Shia struggle is very evident. Weak states are less able to assert independence amid the tug-of-war between sectarian regional powers. And third, we're seeing rising competition between moderate and radical elements of Islam, and ISIL and others are taking advantage of that competition. Within this evolving global context, the role the United States military is taking against the trans-regional threat of ISIL is appropriately matched to the complexity of the environment and is at a level of effort that is sustainable over time. Military power alone, as we've said, will not solve ISIL. I don't think anyone here would disagree with that. All 9 lines of effort need to be considered in the aggregate. This campaign focuses on actively reinforcing and hardening our partners in the region who must, and in most cases are, taking responsibility for their own security. And that's an important point. Enduring stability cannot be imposed in the Middle East from the outside in. The fight is enabled by the coalition, but it must be owned by those regional stakeholders. It bears repeating that this is the beginning of a complex, nonlinear campaign that will require a sustained effort over an extended period of time. We have to be just as agile as the network of terrorists we face. We are constantly evaluating our approach and making sure we're resourcing it appropriately, balanced with our other global commitments. But 4 years and counting of budget uncertainty have made this balance distinctly harder. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, General. Mr. Secretary, let me clear up a couple of points before we get into the strategy. You've stated before you would recommend a veto of the NDAA to the President. Is that your position?
He restated his position yesterday, and I support it. I'm happy to give the reasons for that, if you'd like, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, but you might answer also in your answer. Do you choose between fully funding the President's defense budget request with OCO funding or funding defense at sequestration levels?
Well, the short answer is I'm hoping we can do better than that. My view hasn't changed since I came up here a few months ago on this issue, and the chairman alluded to the problem. I very much hope that a way will be found to come together and get beyond the gridlock that we have, and to give us a normal budget process that provides a stable runway for the department. I'll explain why that is so important. We've been going 1 year at a time budgetarily now for several years straight, and it's extremely disruptive to the operations of the department. It is managerially inefficient because we're in this herky-jerky process. It is difficult to have a multi-year national defense strategy, which we must have, with 1 year at a time perspective. It's difficult to run large programs, shipbuilding programs, aircraft programs efficiently in a 1 year at a time budget. I also believe, Mr. Chairman, that our people deserve better. That is, they need a horizon in front of them, our military people and their families. And last, I travel around the world, as you all do, and it's embarrassing that we cannot, in successive years now, pull ourselves together before an overall budget approach that allows us to do what we need to do, which is we program in a multi-year manner, not in a 1 year at a time manner. So for all those reasons, Mr. Chairman, I just appeal. It's not something that I have any particular expertise in, and it's obviously much bigger than defense, because as noted, the success of this campaign and the success of our national security hinges importantly, very importantly, on this department, the department that I lead, but also on law enforcement and homeland security and diplomacy. So I'm hoping, Mr. Chairman, that we can do better than that choice, and that we don't continue down what I've called a road to nowhere.
Well, you may be presented with that choice, and I would also add this is an authorizing bill. The Appropriations Committee is where the money is. But just very quickly, your confirmation hearing, you stated in response to my question about whether we should arm the Ukrainians. quote, I very much incline in that direction, Mr. Chairman, because I think we need to support the Ukrainians and defend themselves. The nature of those arms, I can't say right now. I haven't confirmed with our military, but I incline in the direction of providing with arms, including to get to what your question is, lethal arms. You still have that position?
I have not changed my thinking in those months, and I had the occasion to talk to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense just the other week. And
Fine,
talk to
I'm
him
just
about the
asking
kind of
whether
military
you're still
support.
you still want to support them, arming them or not. That's a pretty straightforward question.
We're considering that. We have not made a decision in that regard.
are you still-
And we are providing.
Are you still inclined to provide arms to Ukrainians? Please,
not-
Mr. Secretary.
Yes, I haven't changed
Okay,
my view.
thank you. That was it. That was a simple answer to a simple question.
But if I
Thank
could,
you.
just.
No, because I've only got 2 minutes
All right.
left. Thank you. Now we are, 5,000 airstrikes have been conducted. 75% of the airstrikes return without having dropped a weapon. If there's ever a compelling argument for forward air controllers, it seems to me that's the case. Now, you mentioned we are currently training about 60 fighters. I got to tell you, after 4 years, Mr. Secretary, that's not a very impressive number. And is it true that with these people that you are training and equipping to fight in Syria, is it true that you are telling them that they're only there to fight ISIS and not Bashar Assad? Is that true?
Yes, we are telling them to that we are arming and training them in the first instance to go after ISIL and not the Assad regime. That's our priority. And these are people who are inclined in that direction and come from areas that have been overrun by ISIL.
So in other words,
motivation.
if they are barrel bombed by Bashar Assad, they are not.
No, I think we have some obligation to them once they're inserted in the field. Again, we don't expect them to be.
Is that to defend them against barrel bombing?
Well, that decision will be made when we introduce fighters into the
That's
field.
a small comfort to those people you're recruiting right now, that decision will be made later on. Is that fair to these young men to say, we are sending you in to fight ISIS only, and by the way, we will decide on the policy whether to defend you if you are barrel bombed?
They know that we will provide support to them. Exactly what kind of support.
Does that mean you will
under
defend them
what
against Bashar
circumstances.
Assad's barrel bombing? Mr. Secretary, this is not a very pleasant exchange. I'd like to have answers to questions. Will we tell them that we will defend them against Bashar Assad's barrel bombing?
I think we have an obligation to help
Will
them.
we tell them that?
We have not told them that
Not
yet.
told them that. So you're recruiting people and not telling them that they're going to defend them because you haven't made the decision yet, and yet you want to train them quickly and send them in. Now, there is success on the part of an outfit called the Army of Conquest, which is funded and trained and equipped generally, mostly by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and perhaps others. They are succeeding, and they have, if there's battlefield gains, they are achieving them. Does the United States have any relationship with that outfit? Because they are fighting against Bashar Assad as well as ISIS.
I will have to get back to you on the answer to that question because who has that contact is something that we'd have to discuss separately, Mr. Chairman. Can I go back?
Go ahead.
Can I go back, Mr. Chairman? You mentioned the question of air sorties and which fraction of them result in strikes, and I'd like to explain those numbers to you a bit. In the case where the airstrikes are mounted, and I'll ask the chairman to elaborate further on this, in the case where the airstrikes are conducted in a deliberate manner, that is, one knows at the time the aircraft embarks on the sortie what the target will be, in those cases, 93% of the time, they're concluding the sortie. When it comes to dynamic targeting, the fraction is much lower. It's about 37%. And the reason for that is that in the case of dynamic targeting, by its nature, the aircraft is deployed with the expectation that a target of opportunity, let's say something that's moving on the ground or a developing tactical situation, will provide the opportunity for a strike. That doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen about 37% of the time. A fraction, I should note, that is much higher than it was in Afghanistan, where we did the same thing. We routinely flew sorties in order to capitalize upon fleeting opportunities or developing opportunities. So our experience here is, in fact, better than it is in Afghanistan. But anyway, that is what explains
Any experienced pilot will tell you that if you have a forward air controller on the ground to identify those targets, then the number of targets hit is dramatically increased. And we have no forward air controllers on the ground, and that, I can tell you, is incredibly frustrating to the young pilots who are flying these 6.5-hour sorties, who feel that they are not achieving anything. Mr. Secretary, you might want to talk to them as well, since they're the ones that are doing the fighting.
If I can address the question of JTACs, I think that's a fundamental one, and Chairman, and since you've raised it, let me go back to the fundamentals of the strategy, which are to support capable and motivated ground forces when we find them. And we are supporting such capable and effective ground forces. For example, just to give one example, the Kurds in northern Syria now.
Mr. Secretary, my time is way up, but that has nothing to do with not having forward air controllers on the ground. I hate to cut you short, but we're 3 minutes over.
I'm just saying we don't rule that out, and our strategy doesn't.
You never rule it out. It hasn't happened. Mr. Reed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I was struck by your statement and said that the first and arguably most critical line with our efforts is the political one led by the State Department. And in your colloquy with the chairman, you pointed out that there are challenges with respect to a year-to-year OCO funding that's being proposed, but the state doesn't even have option to that source of funding. So are you concerned that they might be so resource deprived under the Budget Control Act that they could not be the primary?
I am. The State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, other agencies that are critical to protecting us against ISIL and other threats, they need resources too. And so that's another reason why I appeal for an overall budget perspective, and I realize it involves lots of moving parts and would require a major coming together to release the gridlock of the last few years. But I really appeal for that, not just for my own department, but for the rest of the national security establishment. I think it's critical.
Shifting to the training effort in Iraq, one of the first issues was the composition of the provisional forces that rallied a year ago to try to defend Baghdad. It's overwhelming Shia. And now we're beginning to see Sunnis appear. First, is that the deliberate cooperation of the government in Baghdad? Finally getting the message that they have to have the support of the Sunni community? And second, are you beginning to see a trend that is a positive one in the sense of the overall participation of Sunnis?
We see the commitment of Prime Minister Abadi, so different from the behavior of his predecessor, to engage in a multi-sectarian way in the fight against ISIL. That includes the Kurds and it includes Sunnis. Now that's gone slowly, which explains why the numbers are small. We expect them to grow. We hope they grow. But what we need from the Iraqi government is the enrollment of Sunnis in the Iraqi security forces and the commitment of the Iraqi government to pay them, to equip them with our help, which we provide, and then to get back to the chairman's question about direct support to them, when we have effective ground forces under the control of the Iraqi government, we are prepared to do more to support them. But we need to have those effective ground forces because local forces on the ground, we know from experience, is the only way to create a lasting defeat of ISIL, and that's what the strategy is all about.
General Dempsey, can you comment on your perception of the situation in terms of Sunni forces in Anbar province particularly, and the government in Baghdad's relationship with them, expediting weapons, providing support more than rhetorically, but actually?
I can, Senator, thanks. As the Secretary mentioned, the good intentions of Prime Minister Abadi have not always been met with activity at echelons or levels of bureaucracy beneath him. And so there was a period of time when, frankly, we had the capability to bring them in, but we couldn't generate the recruits. That situation has improved, I think, probably as a result of their failure in Ramadi. And what we see now is a renewed effort by the Prime Minister to empower his ISF, his Iraqi security force leaders, to reach out to the Sunni tribes and to arm them. It's our policy to do that through the central government, not directly, because our objective is a unified Iraq. If it became clear that that wasn't going to happen, we'd have to reconsider the campaign.
One of the observations is the leadership at the tactical level, all the way up to brigade and division of the Iraqi security forces, continually seems to be unimpressive. Is there active changes going on right now to ensure that the leadership at the brigade, division level is competent? In fact, it is startling because it appears that ISIL, in fact, there is some indication there are former Ba'athist officers operating with them, are much more operationally and tactically capable than the Iraqi security forces. Your comments?
I do, sir. We tend to look at the tactical shifting and who owns how much territory and how many airstrikes, for example, but we also need to watch Iraqi leadership changes. Recently, that we received an open source report that their chief of defense would be retired. We consider that to be a very positive thing. There's issues up and down the chain of command. We also watch carefully the distribution of their budget, how much money is going into the Ministry of Defense, how much is going into the Popular Mobilization Force, how oil is being generated and the revenue shared. We watch the influence of the Ministry of Defense, whether the ISF is the dominant force for the government of Iraq or whether that dominance is shifting to the Popular Mobilization Forces, the relationship of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police, and we watch the activities of the Shia militia. In every case, there's indications, there's positive indications, and in every case, there's indications that concern us.
Quickly, Ms. Secretary, because you just a moment left, the issues comes up about the training, equipping of forces going into Syria. I would presume, and the General might want to comment also, that part of the plan to insert these forces would be to protect them as much as possible from any type of response, to focus them on ISIL, but also to put them in places in the country where they would be much less likely to be engaged. But if they were engaged, they would not only have the right to defend themselves, but my presumption would be we would assist them from defending themselves from attack. Is that a fair estimate?
That's my feeling. That's what I said, that I think we have an obligation to do so. You're right. I don't expect that occasion to arise anytime soon. And to get to the chairman's point earlier, in the very first vetting, the thing, Mr. Chairman, that made the numbers so small, and I said the number 60, and I can look out at your faces and you have the same reaction I do, which is that that's an awfully small number. Why is that number so small, this in the first class? And the reason for that has to do with the criteria we apply, and some of this is the law, to these recruits. We do counterintelligence screening. We make sure that they, for example, aren't going to pose a green-on-blue threat to their trainers. that they don't have any history of atrocities. These are all things that are required of us, and that they're willing to engage in the campaign in a way that's compliant with the law of armed conflict. All of this is the legal, and I would say principled, I'm not arguing with it, policies of the U.S. as far as those fighters are concerned, and that's why 60 of them got out the other end of the process. Now, General Nagata, who's doing the training, I indicated he's got 7,000 more, expects that we'll do better as we get better, and that number 60, which is not impressive, will get larger over time as he learns more, to get to the chairman's earlier point, about the groups that are willing to cooperate with us. When we do get them, they will deserve our support, and we'll give our support to them. It's going to take some time, obviously, to get the numbers up to the point where they can really have an effect.
Thank you. Thank you.
I should point out, by the way, what we're talking about fighting in Syria, while these numbers are small, this particular trade and equip, I just need to point out that there are other capable ground forces fighting both the regime and ISIL, some of which we can support and do support with ISR, airstrikes and so forth. I gave the example of the Syrian Kurds. But we'd like to see more, and we're trying to get better at training them, because the number 60 is, as you all recognized, is not an impressive number.
Thank you.
Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, this is a tough job you've undertaken, but as my wife reminds me when I complain, don't blame me, you asked for the job. But I'm not sure you asked for it. You were asked to take the job. But at any rate, Senator McCain's opening comment is exceedingly important. It goes to the key what we are here for. The whole purpose of this hearing is how to confront and stop ISIS in the Levant. So we want to talk about that, not all these other strategies, General Dempsey, other threats around the world. We need a strategy on this problem. And I'm deeply disappointed. I don't see the confidence in your testimony or General Dempsey's testimony. I believe we're carrying out a strategy that the President has. And I don't believe it has sufficient respect for the use of military force necessary to be successful. I mean, I hate to be a critic about this. And this is important. Senator McCain warned in 2011 we should not pull out all our troops, and we needed to remain engaged in that country. And he's also warned you if we do it in Afghanistan, the same thing is liable to happen there, both of which would be tragedies of monumental proportions considering how much we have invested, the soldiers General Dempsey led in Iraq. So I'm worried. I'm not happy about this. I think delusion is a word that's too accurate. So I just wanted to say that here at the beginning. And I hope we'll get into more details about what you plan to do to reverse this action. And at some point, the President's going to have to change his mind, it seems to me. He cannot just function based on a campaign promise when reality is different. All right. So
would you like me to address that? It's a very fair question. Let me just go back to the issue of the strategy, and then I'll say something about Afghanistan. The strategy is for defeating ISIL on the ground in Syria and Iraq is to train and then enable local forces. That takes some time. I know it's difficult.
General Dempsey was training the Iraqi forces 8 years ago. I visited him in Iraq. That was his primary responsibility. We've been training them for nearly a decade. And that's not the problem right now. I think the problem is confidence within the Iraqi government and the Iraqi soldiers that they're going to be supported and that they're going to be victorious. And if they had that confidence, you'd get more recruits.
I agree with that. And that is what was lacking under Maliki. You're absolutely right.
Well, you just said strategy. The strategy, I believe you used the word strategy, is to support capable and motivated ground forces where we find them. Well, I think General Stewart, a few months ago, testified in the new Defense Intelligence Agency head, who was there in the Al Anbar region and led the effort that the forces, when they turned it around in Iraq. General Dempsey, you remember that effort. And he said, when pressed, I felt that he was reluctant because it wasn't administration policy, but he acknowledged that when you have embedded soldiers, forward and observers, United States forces embedded with troops moving out into combat situations, that those Iraqi troops will perform better. Do you agree with that, General Dempsey?
I agree that there are points on the battlefield where the presence of forward observers, JTACs, embedded soft forces would make them more capable.
And they would, so is our strategy now, does it remain that we will not do that?
I can tell you that I have not recommended it. Now,
Well,
whether we do it or not, I'm telling you that I haven't recommended it, Senator.
Well, if it
And I
would
can
make a
explain why,
difference.
if you'd like.
Well, I would like to
Okay,
know why.
let's take the issue of air power, because it seems to be the most prominent one. At a similar period in the Afghanistan conflict in 2012, the number of aircraft that returned with their ordnance because there were not targets available on the ground was 83%. It's 65% in Iraq right now. The JTACs and the Special Forces observers are not a silver bullet to the destruction of ISIL. The silver bullet is getting the Iraqis to fight.
Well, I totally agree with that. I just believe that we had a few forces, 1,000 forces in Mosul. Mosul never would have fallen. So, so now our policy is to try to take back this territory. What is the reluctance? What is the reluctance that use our special forces here? See, this is what bothers me. I'm not. I understand the problem in Syria, and I'm dubious about what we got to do about Syria. I don't know. We probably should not have involved ourselves in Libya, but we are committed. We committed our nation in Iraq, General. We've been deeply committed for over a decade there. So is it now our policy that you're refusing to even allow special forces to be embedded with, say, 2 special forces with 600 Iraqi troops in a battalion? You're rejecting that idea?
What I have recommended is that if we find a unit which is led and is responsive and has an offensive mission where we can enable them or increase their likelihood of success, that I will make that recommendation. But to restore or to put embedded advisors in on a habitual basis, the environment is just not simply set to do that. And so, and by the way, it's not reluctance. We've got 1,600 pilots flying over Iraq and Syria today.
Well, why won't we?
We've got 3,500 boots on the ground doing train, advise, and assist.
So if we had a few advisors in the Iraqi battalions, you're saying that would not make a positive impact on their morale and their capabilities to actually win?
What I'm saying, Senator, is that for a brief temporal tactical gain, we should wait until we see a strategic opportunity to do that.
Well, I would think if we started having some wins, ISIS would have fewer recruits and we'd have better morale with the Iraqi recruits too, and they'd fight better. It's a chicken and the egg perhaps, but I think it's very important. And I hope you'll reevaluate that and recommend to the President we do that, because I think without that, we're not going to be effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here in the service to our country. I appreciate it very much. And as you can tell, this is a pretty sensitive subject, and it's a very concerning subject to all of us. As I go around the state of West Virginia, my little state, it's a very hawkish state and a very patriotic state and a lot of veterans. Speak to all of them. They're confused right now. They really are of what, and you heard the frustration coming out, but basically, Iraq is not a united country. You have the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds. And I think Secretary Carter, you've said that, until they have the will, and I think Secretary or General Dempsey, you all said the same thing, till Iraq has the will to fight. But which group has the will to fight to defend the other group? And that's what we're having a problem. And I think it's been said, well, if you have a group that's fighting and the Kurds want to fight, why do we still have to make them go through the Baghdad centralized government in order for them to get the weapons they need to defend themselves and be aggressive? So they're confused about that. They're confused about, in Syria, trying to spend the money to find people to train, when you've acknowledged that we only had 60 of them successful right now, and the amount of effort we're spending there. But yet, I think at that, you said you had the Kurds, Syrian Kurds, that were fighting, and some things of that sort. I don't know. And then I'm asked the question. They said, we continue to keep trying to train and arm the Iraqis. And it seems like all they're doing is supplying the ISIL with the equipment that the Americans are giving them. And when are we ever going to stop, giving equipment to the people that won't defend it and fight for it? So I guess, are we talking, or at your level, are you talking to the White House about rethinking the whole Iraqi position as far as one centralized government, one Iraq, or maybe a separated Iraq?
I think we're all aware that it is very difficult to govern Iraq in a multi-sectarian manner. And so have we thought about all the alternatives to that? I think we all have, actually, for years, and I'm sure all of you have as well. We are trying to assist Prime Minister Abadi in governing in a different way from the way Maliki governed, which, as Senator Sessions noted, led to the disintegration of the Iraqi security forces, the sectarian coloration of them, and that's what ultimately led to their collapse in Sunni territory.
Secretary Carter, if I could ask this question also along those lines. I've been asked the question, you just reminded me. They said, didn't we see signs that Maliki was incompetent, that he would have gone strictly to a sectarian position as he did, not for a strong, united Iraq? Did we not, with all the people we've had there, did we not see that coming and could not have averted that from happening?
I can only speak for myself in that regard, and I was not closely involved in it in the time. I certainly had that concern about Mr. Maliki, and I know that many of you met with him. I met with him several times, and it was quite apparent to me. Now, Prime Minister Abadi says he has a different intention, which is to govern Iraq from the center, but in a decentralized enough way that the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shia each have enough space to carry on their own welfare in the way that they wish, but there is a single integral Iraqi state. And that is what he says he's working towards, and we're supporting him in that regard. That's why, for example, when we provide arms to the Kurds, we do it with the consent of the Iraqi government in order to indicate that we support the idea of a single Iraqi government in Baghdad, but we also want the Kurds in the fight and armed, and that has not delayed our arming of the Kurds.
It seems like the biggest problem we have is with the Sunnis and the Shiites within.
And then the Sunnis and the Shiites, and this is why it's so important to take the time to train a truly multi-sectarian Iraqi force. There are elements of the Iraqi forces that have that right character. For example, there's CTS.
General.
And so our strategy, just to go to the beginning, is to train and equip those local forces. They're essential. Then we can help them, and it is a chicken and egg thing, except that you need to have the capable and motivated ground force. Then we can enable it rather than to substitute for it, which doesn't lead to a lasting result.
I would think, General Dempsey, that it's been pointed out here that we've spent multiple years, 10 years plus, $1 trillion, lost a lot of lives in Iraq, and we had 100,000 troops there at one time trying to train and defend and get them motivated, and that didn't work. So that's the hard question. I mean, how do you go home and answer that? How do I go home and answer that we're going to try this over again? Maybe we'll do a better job of retraining. I think that was the frustration you're seeing coming out of Senator Sessions.
Well, I share it. But I think it's probably worth mentioning that my judgment about how this will evolve over time is that it's a generational issue. It is trans-regional, Senator. It's, it is elements of it in Afghanistan. We see it in Iraq and Syria. We see it in the Sinai. We see it in Libya. And we can't just focus like a laser beam on one part of it. It has to be pressured across it. And so what we're trying to do is achieve an enduring defeat, which means we got to work it through partners, because they have more to gain and more to lose. And finally, we've got to find a sustainable level of effort, since I do believe this is a generational challenge.
Yeah, and I just think that basically my question would be overall, are we trying to defend the British lines that were drawn 100 years ago and putting people in a territory that they don't believe that's their country? I mean, why are we forcing something upon people that don't want to accept?
So I'll just follow up with you. I also share that concern, that the Mideast will never be the Mideast again.
Yeah.
And so everything that I recommend to the Secretary and to the President is recommended with the intention of being flexible enough that we can build upon it if we do find that inclusive national unity government in Iraq or not.
Thank you.
I can't help but mention the situation was stabilized after the surge, and we had won. And we predicted if everybody was pulled out that the situation would descend into chaos. It is a fact that thanks to General Petraeus and the surge and great sacrifice, Iraq war was won. And to ignore that in that conversation, Mr. General Dempsey, is to me intellectually dishonest.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Ayotte.
Mr. Chairman, I just for the record, President George W. Bush signed an agreement with the Maliki government to withdraw all forces. At the end
We'll
of
have this debate
2011.
later on, but it was clear that we could have, and everybody knows they could have, and the people who were there knows they could have. Senator Ayotte.
I want to thank both of you for being here, for your service to the country. We appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, Secretary Carter, you had said in answer to Senator Manchin that, in fact, the arms that we're providing to the Kurds, we're doing so with the consent of the Iraqi central government. Does that mean we're doing it directly, or are we going still through the Iraqi central government?
Well, first of all, we're not the only ones, but we and others basically convey the weapons directly to the Kurds, but we inform the Iraqi government and get their formal consent to it. So it doesn't delay the arming of the Kurds, but we're trying to stick up for basically the central government.
Because previously we had heard complaints about it originally going through the Iraqi central government and then to the Kurds. So I'm glad to hear that we're directly providing it to the Kurds, letting the Iraqi central government know what we're providing.
Mr. Barzani was here in town. You may have met with him a few weeks ago, and he was grateful for what was being provided, and he noted that the delays, which is the principal problem that were experienced early on, are not being experienced now, either in the shipment of our equipment or that of others. For example, the Germans providing anti-tank munitions, which they value very much. But we are trying to stick up for the principle that Iraq is a single, unitary, multi-sectarian state. And difficult as that may be, that is much preferred to the alternative, which is the sectarian disintegration of Iraq.
Let me follow up. So clearly the Kurds are capable and motivated. And at this point, what are they receiving all of the weapons that they've asked for? Because as I understood it, ISIS unfortunately has captured some of the armaments that we left in Iraq, and some of them heavy armaments. The Kurds are quite effective, but it's hard if you're out-armed. And are they now receiving, what have they requested that we're not providing, and if so, why?
I'll let Chairman Dempsey answer that, but again, just to say it's not just us. I think there are more than 12 nations overall arming the Kurds, and I noted I was with the German defense minister over in Germany last week, and she was providing to the Kurds these critical anti-tank weapons of a kind the Germans make that is especially effective. So it's not just us. And the Kurds are an example of what we're looking for, which is an effective ground force that'll stick up for itself, hold together, take and hold territory, and that's why we're providing them with support.
So we agree with that. I think that there's been broad agreement on that, and so we just want to make sure that they have what they need.
Senator, I'm not aware of anything that they've asked for that we haven't provided. We probably haven't provided it in the quantity that they may have desired, MRAPs, for example, and we're working to address those quantity issues.
I wanted to follow up on a different topic, because General Dempsey, you mentioned in your testimony some of the other challenges we face around the world, including the malign influence of Iran. And recently, I read it today in the press that, in fact, Iran was actually pushing for the lifting of the arms embargo at the UN, and also the resolution that bans Iran from developing ballistic missiles. So I wanted to get both of your thoughts on those two issues and the importance of, as we look at Iran's malign influence in the region. As far as I can tell, we still see Iran not only supporting the Assad regime, Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels, and also we've heard reports on the Taliban undermining our interests. So your thoughts on those two issues?
I'll start, Marty, if it's okay. You're right that I can't speak to what's going on in the negotiations. Secretary Kerry's conducting those negotiations, but I agree with your perspective, namely that we have serious concerns with Iranian malign activities outside of the nuclear issue, which is the focus of those talks. And it is in several different locations around the region. And whatever happens as far as an agreement over the nuclear program with respect to Iran is concerned, I think we, and certainly I feel this, have a clear duty in the Department of Defense, first of all, to defend our friends and allies, keep a robust posture in the Gulf, our friends and allies to include especially Israel, maintain our robust posture, and continue to maintain the military means to strike Iran's nuclear program if we were ordered to do so. We work on all three of those things, and we'll work on them whether or not an agreement is reached in Geneva.
So just to be clear, Secretary, it doesn't sound like, based on what you're saying, given their malign activities in the region, that it would be a good idea to lift the arms embargo right now on what Iran receives. Would you agree with me on that?
No, we want them to continue to be isolated as a military and limited in terms of the kind of equipment and material they're able to.
And also, can you explain to us why is it important that we also continue to stop them from having an ICBM program? Because we know they have one.
Yeah,
but also
that's
from the development.
The reason that we want to stop Iran from having an ICBM program is that the I in ICBM stands for intercontinental, which means having the capability to fly from Iran to the United States, and we don't want that. So that's why we oppose ICBMs. Chairman, do you want to add anything on any of those points?
Just to answer your question, because you posed it to both of us, we should, under no circumstances, should we relieve pressure on Iran relative to ballistic missile capabilities and arms trafficking.
Thank you. I also just wanted to point out something, Secretary Carter, when the chairman had asked you about the defense authorization. One thing that I think needs to be pointed out, the president has said he will veto it. The defense authorization received 71 votes in the Senate. I would describe that as very bipartisan, and so it troubles me that he would seek to veto something that received 71 votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thank you. Secretary, thank you. I just got back from Iraq with Senator McCain, who led our trip, And one of the meetings we had was with a number of the Sunni tribal leaders, and some of them were from the Haditha area. And in talking to them, they said, we have stood with you, we have faith with you, but we have people who are now eating grass in our town. We have no food, we have no supplies, and we have been told the only airlifts that can come in would be on military transport. Is there anything you can do to help feed our people? And so I wanted to put that before you to see if there's something we can do to be of aid to these individuals.
Well, I'll say something about that and then ask the chairman if he wants to add. First of all, I want to thank you, Senator Donnelly, also Senator Kane, for traveling there. We appreciate it on behalf of the 3,550 members of our armed forces that are in Iraq and conducting this fight. Thank you for taking the time to go visit them this 4th of July weekend. The humanitarian situation is yet another tragic consequence of what's gone on in ISIL. It remains one of the coalition's efforts, as I indicated in my opening statement, to relieve the humanitarian situation. That's very difficult to do when there is not order and control in the ground. And so this is why we need to get a security situation that's stable, ground forces that are capable of seizing territory, holding territory, and governing. That's the only way to get the humanitarian situation turned around, either in Iraq or in Syria. It's very sad and it's tragic. And in the case of Iraq, as has been noted, something brought about by the reemergence of sectarianism in a really tragic way. Chairman, you want to add anything?
One of the reasons we went to Taqadum Air Base, also locally called Habaniya, is to advise and assist in the Anbar Operations Center, which is where these kind of issues should actually migrate through. And you should be interested to know the Iraqis have the capability to address that. They have C-130J, state-of-the-art cargo.
I know they do, but they're not.
Yeah, well, we'll pass it to the guy who's embedded in the
And when you're hungry, your stomach doesn't tell you want Iraqi food or U.S. food. You just want help. And one of the bonds created with these tribal leaders is they said, we've always felt we could count on you. And to follow up on that, as we look at Ramadi and other areas in the Iraqi armed forces, one of the great tragedies of this whole thing was that the number of ISIS fighters in Ramadi was extraordinarily insignificant in terms of the overall number, but the Iraqi forces headed the other way. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on making sure that the Iraqi forces know that there's no back door anymore. There's only one way through Ramadi, and that's forward.
I'll say something about that, and then Chairman, you may want to add. The way you recount the fall of Ramadi is exactly correct. Ramadi needs to be retaken, and the way to do it is to have a force under the command and control, competent command and control of Iraqi security forces commanders, which has been a challenge, and a plan and the means to, as you say, make sure that they don't bog down and they're able to take Ramadi and move through Ramadi. This will be a test of the competence of the Iraqi security forces. And it's a test that they must pass, and therefore our and the coalition's involvement is to try to train and equip and support them to be successful. And we're going to take the time and encourage them to take the time so that the operation, when they do conduct it, is successful.
One of the side spin-offs that when it is successful and Ramadi is taken back is that ISIS will then look for a quick PR claim somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so I just want to make sure that we're ready in surrounding towns and in surrounding areas that when Ramadi falls, we know they're going to step somewhere else, and that we have a plan in place to protect those other towns as well.
The Ramadi campaign, which about a month ago was about to be executed precipitously has actually been, with our help, is now a very deliberate campaign, first to isolate it and then to go back and recapture it with a supporting effort in Fallujah. So our presence in the Anbar Operations Center is allowing the Iraqi security forces to take a more deliberate campaign approach and to avoid the very toothpaste aspect of the way ISIL squirts around the battlefield when you squeeze it in one place and it turns up another. But this is very much us helping them understand the threat and formulate a campaign to address it so that they get credit for it and that they become credible to the people of Al-Anbar province.
Well, as I'm sure you know, the Sunni tribal leaders, they have a tremendous value for the relationship they've established over the years with the United States, established in blood and treasure. And so what gives them confidence more than anything is knowing that not that our soldiers are in the front, not that our soldiers are in the combat, but that we're there to help guide and help provide advice and help provide plan and help provide air cover is the other thing that they talked to us about. They said, you have no idea how our spirits soar when we see your air assets. And so they want to make sure that all of that is going to be in place as we move forward. Then they're willing to buy in. If not, they feel their families are exposed. One last thing I wanted to ask you, I see my time is running short, and that is in Syria, and you don't have to answer this, I'll ask second round. You know, the question comes up, so when Assad goes, if Assad goes, how does the space get filled with people who we think can be of help as opposed to Nusra or ISIS? And I know that's the tremendous challenge you have too. And it seems like we are getting further behind the curve as opposed to in front of the curve on that question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, thank you for appearing today for your testimony. I would like to associate myself with the remarks that Chairman McCain made earlier today about arming the Ukrainian government. He and I traveled there last month to as far east as we could go to Dnipropetrovsk. We saw very brave and skilled soldiers. We saw them doing things like constructing unmanned aerial vehicles out of styrofoam to meet their needs. And in addition to the lethal aid they need, they also still need a substantial amount of non-lethal aid. Some soldiers have the improved first aid kits that our soldiers have been carrying overseas. Some soldiers have first aid kits that look like they came out of the prop scenes in MASH, in addition to radar systems and radios and so forth. But moving on to the Islamic State. One point that I don't think has been discussed here today is the Islamic State in Egypt. There have been a series of spectacular terrorist attacks in the Sinai Peninsula. The Islamic State takes credit for those attacks. We still have the multinational force and observers in the Sinai Peninsula, almost 1,800 soldiers, 1,200 of which are American personnel. Secretary Carter, General Dempsey, can you explain to us what steps we've taken to ensure that our troops in the Sinai Peninsula are adequately protected and are working with the Egyptian security forces to not just defend themselves, but try to defeat the Islamic State in the Sinai Peninsula?
Thank you. Let me address the Ukraine part first, and then the chairman can address Sinai. First of all, thank you for going to Ukraine. I've been there many times, and the government there and the people there, particularly in the western part of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's conduct there has had the opposite of whatever effect he thought it might have in terms of attracting Ukraine in the direction of Russia. He has strengthened the feeling among Ukrainians, particularly in the western part of the country, that they want to have a future that they determine and that isn't determined from outside. And to get to your point, we're constantly assessing, and this gets back to the chairman's earlier point, the kind of assistance that we provide to the Ukrainians. The principal kind of assistance, however, is I'll come back to the military part in a moment, but I can't emphasize the importance of economic assistance to Ukraine. And that's largely in the hands of the Europeans, and so also are the sanctions against Russia. And that's really the main event. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of that. That's because that's mostly a matter for the EU rather than the United States. We are less directly involved, but we certainly support the EU, both in its sanctions against Russia, which we share, but theirs are more important because their volume of trade is greater, and also their efforts to strengthen the Ukrainian government and economy, support reform there, and the independence of Ukraine. I did talk to, as I mentioned, to the defense minister there about what he needed, and his principal focus was on training. And so, as I said, we'll constantly reassess that, but we are assessing that, and I'm open to what we do in the future. I've indicated that. I continue to indicate that. But his emphasis was on training, and we have trainers now in Yavoriv, which is the principal training range there. That's much appreciated. He was asking me and us for more of that kind of training. I think we'll continue to do that and to support the Ukrainian military. I should say that the defense minister of Ukraine used to be the interior minister, which is a very good combination because the Russian and separatist threat is a hybrid kind of threat. Hybrid in the sense that it's signified by the little green men phenomenon, a combination of the exercise of malign influence through sort of KGB-type tactics on the one hand, and battlefield operations on the other. And he's somebody who really understands that kind of hybrid warfare. Yeah. That's really where he wants our help.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I don't mean to cut you off, but I would like to go on the Sinai and have other questions.
Yeah, on the MFO, about 9 months ago, anticipating and watching the intel stream about the radicalization of the Sinai and the fact that the Egyptian armed forces had moved resources to their western border. We actually did a joint staff integrated vulnerability assessment, and as a result of that, we introduced Blue Force Tracker, raid towers, changed movement techniques, enhanced their communications, put in some counter-mortar radars, things that you're very familiar with. We also have been in touch with our Egyptian Armed Forces colleagues. They've increased the number of they've brought back Egyptian Armed Forces into the Sinai. They accompany us on our movements when we make them. And of course, we recently released some of the capabilities that had been withheld from them so that they could address their terrorist threat in the Sinai.
You're confident that American personnel in the Sinai currently has adequate protection against terrorist activity there?
I'm confident that they are adequately protected today, but I fully expect that threat to increase. And in fact, I recently had a conversation with the Secretary about the future of the MFO mission, which, as you know, really hasn't changed in the last 50 years.
Thank you. I'd now like to move to the heart of the Middle East and the Islamic State. For the record, I think the Islamic State is a grave and growing threat. But until they develop their own ballistic missile program and until they have thousands of centrifuges and tons of uranium, I believe the Islamic Republic will be a graver threat than the Islamic State, that is, the Islamic Republic of Iran. My objections to the course we've taken in the nuclear negotiations are well known, and I will not repeat them here. But I will note that Iran remains an anti-American, terror-sponsoring outlaw regime that is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans from Lebanon to Iraq, Afghanistan. General Dempsey, you served 3 different tours in or associated with Iraq. How many American soldiers died at the hands of Iranian militias or explosively formed projectiles during your command?
Yeah, I recently heard both the Chief of Staff of the Army and the current CENTCOM commander put that number at about 500.
Hundreds of Americans died, and probably thousands were wounded or suspected of being wounded. What should we say to their families, the families who lost soldiers at the hands of Iranian militias or Iranian roadside bombs, once we reach a deal that's going to give Iran tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief and international legitimacy without them changing their behavior?
I tell you what I've told them is that solving the nuclear issue diplomatically is a positive outcome, but make no mistake about it, there's at least 5 other malign activities in which Iran is engaged that cause me grave security concerns, and we won't take our eye on those 5, and you know what they are: ballistic missiles, sea-based mines, cyber activities, arms trafficking, and surrogates and proxies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Carter and General Dempsey, for being here and for your commitment. General Dempsey, you testified before the House Armed Services Committee that, I quote, "I would not recommend we put U.S. forces in harm's way," we were talking about Iraq, "simply to stiffen the spine of local forces." And you continued, "If their spine is not stiffened by the threat of ISIL on their way of life, nothing we do is going to stiffen their spine." So, General Dempsey, what is it going to take to stiffen the spines of the local forces?
Yeah, actually, Senator, what I said was that if it takes us to stiffen their spine in the face of a threat that is
Yes.
existential to them, then it doesn't seem to me that they're going to be stiffened. But I do think there are, if you ask me, the things that we are doing, I mentioned a few of them earlier, about expanding our network of points where we touch them, help them train, help them target, help them understand how they integrate with each other, Army and police. I think those things have had the effect of giving them greater confidence. I just made the point that I don't think the added step of accompanying them into combat would make a strategic difference, except if we get to the point where there's a major offensive that we think will only or could be increased in terms of its probability of success by our presence.
So as far as you're concerned, we are doing those, taking those steps that will enable them to be able to fight for themselves. Because I agree with you that there is no number of our troops that we can send there that will result in a lasting kind of situation. You also talked about your recent trip to Israel, where you discussed various scenarios involving Assad's departure. I don't know whether Assad's departure is anywhere in the near future, but let's assume that there is a departure. How would his departure affect the dynamics of what happens in Syria? Would ISIL step in to fill the power vacuum? And how would Assad's departure change our strategy regarding ISIL?
So let me tell you about our military planning efforts. Our Israeli counterparts and our Jordanian counterparts very much believe that the possibility of either the regime collapsing or enclaving itself in Tartus, Latakia, Homs, and Hana is possible. And so they were very eager to have consultations with us about what that would precipitate. And your description of it is one that at least our regional partners express, which is to say we don't want this to be a foot race, if it occurs, between al-Nusra and ISIL and Ansar all of these other groups converging on Damascus. I won't sit here today and tell you that I have the answer to that, but I will tell you that we're in consultations, even as I sit here, with the Turks, the Israelis, and the Jordanians about that scenario.
Well, so what you're doing is to prepare for that possible eventuality and to ensure that these other groups do not just step in and take over. But if, let's say that, well, let me put it this way. If Assad departs, does that somehow make our mission against ISIL simpler, easier to target? Is that a way to think about it?
Okay, I'm on a roll. That's a subject of great debate, actually. The debate framed somewhat this way. Is the presence of Assad the catalyst for these issues, these radical ideologies and violent extremist organizations? Or did they emanate somehow else and they simply use the presence of the Assad regime as a recruiting tool? Depending on how you answer that question, will largely shape how you think about solving the problems. The situation militarily is such that what we're trying to provide with partners is options. That is to say, we're trying to form a network of partners, partners that we may not have conceived before, like the YPG, the Syrian Kurds in and around Kobani and over to the east bank of the Euphrates River. We're trying to provide options that will allow us to shape and to react depending on what the internal situation, how it evolves. And we're working most closely with those who border Syria, who have, again, the most to gain and the most to lose.
Turning to the training that we're doing with the moderate Syrian forces, we recognize that you're having great difficulty while training not only the Syrians but also in Iraq. And you've described this as a generational challenge. So while we're slowly training the local forces to fight for themselves, what are some of the other things that we need to be doing contemporaneously? Is it those 9 action items that need to be occurring at the same time as the training is?
It is. For
Senator
example, Senator, if I may, in recognition of the fact that it's going to take some time to build the forces that defeat ISIL on the territory of Syria and Iraq, that's a fact. We're going to do that. I'm sure we'll be successful at that, but it's going to take some time. We need to defend ourselves in the meantime, because there are parts of ISIL that would like to attack us and our friends around the world, and that's where Homeland Security and the FBI and the rest of our efforts to protect ourselves come in. So on the one hand, we need to go to the territory where ISIL arose and defeat it there, and we will do that. But at the same time, and in the meantime, we need to continue to defend our people and our country against these guys. And some of them have the ambition to go to Syria, train, and come back to the United States. You see that already in Europe. We see some signs of that in the United States, and that's why I was so laborious in describing the 9 lines of effort. The ones we're talking about that we have principal responsibility are 2 of those 9, but the others really are critical as well, because as Senator Cotton said a moment ago, ISIL is a grave threat. These guys do want to do us harm, and our friends and allies in the region. If I can say something about this, you asked about the Assad regime, and the chairman answered that. Obviously, what we would like to see occur is for Assad to leave the scene, but for the state of Syria not to disintegrate completely, because we know what's down that road, sectarian disintegration. And now that is a diplomatic task that is underway, as the chairman indicated, and that is the outcome that would be by far preferable, I think, not only for the United States and our national security interests, but for the people of Syria who are suffering so terribly now. There's so many refugees, and it's really a tragic situation in the human sense. But Assad needs to go, but the structures of governance need to stay, or we hope they will stay, because we know what life is like without structures of governance in the Middle East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, first of all, let me just say thank you for your service to the country. We find ourselves, as you have stated, in a very precarious position in a number of areas. General Dempsey, as I sat here and listened to your assessment of the world today, from your point of view, it was alarming to find that location after location, we find ourselves being challenged, and we find ourselves being pressured into positions that perhaps 10 years ago we would not have found ourselves in, whether it be with regard to the Pacific Rim areas or whether it be find ourselves in the Ukraine area and so forth. Our challenges are many, and yet at the same time, it doesn't appear that this has come in as a surprise. As you move farther along, and specifically into the area that we had today, which was in terms of our challenges with ISIL and defeating ISIL, it seems to me that we found ourselves once again in a position where there really weren't surprises. But I'm just curious, the Secretary stated that in Iraq, the Iraqi security forces were severely degraded after 4 divisions dissolved and Mosul fell a year ago this June. The Secretary wasn't in his position at the time you were, sir. Was that a surprise to you?
Well, they collapsed because of poor governance and sectarianism. I was surprised at the rapidity of it. And I suppose I would suggest to you that the degree to which the leadership had been changed out for all the wrong reasons by the Maliki government were the conditions under which that occurred.
If the 4 divisions that were lost there, if they were there today, would 4 divisions, does that make a difference between us moving forward with the defeat of ISIS, or is that not the right number? What's the right number that it's going to take in terms of boots on the ground, not American boots on the ground, but literally allied forces on the ground? What's the number that it takes in order to move forward with whatever strategies are in place, if there are strategies in place, and I'm assuming that we'll get into that, but what's the number that we want to see on the ground?
The commander of CENTCOM has testified that to recapture Mosul eventually, he believes he will need approximately 9 brigades worth of security forces, 6 from the government of Iraq and 3 from the Kurdish region. That would be for Mosul. And then, of course, restoration of the border, which would be the ultimate step, restoration of their sovereign territory defined as the border between Syria and Iraq. That would be largely a federal police or border issue, and I'm not aware that number has been identified. But the initial goal is to form or re-equip 9 brigades.
What's the time frame that could be accomplished in?
That putting a temporal dimension on this is risky at best because the campaign is dependent on a coalition and it's dependent on the network of actors that include the Sunni tribes, the Iraqi security forces themselves, the counter-terror service, and the Kurds. The act of describing when those groups could all come together to establish the conditions to do this is just difficult to pin down. Even if I knew the answer to that question, I would be loath to report it to you in an open hearing. But I've said that from the beginning that it was probably a 3-year effort to restore sovereignty to Iraq, and we're 8 months into that.
You know, General, we pride ourselves and we point out the fact that we truly do have the greatest fighting force the world has ever seen. And yet right now we find ourselves, as the President stated some time ago, he called ISIS the JV team. Clearly that's not the position that I think the administration would take today. We've identified that they are clearly a threat. We've identified a 9-point plan here, Mr. Secretary, in which you've identified all of the things that have to happen, including the defense of our country from these individuals. At what point during this 3-year time frame, or what is the possibility during this 3-year time frame that the patience that you've shown, General, and that the Secretary has alluded to here to build this up, what is the probability that this time frame gets away from us? What are we in a position to make this thing last for 3 years without literally upping on our own point in order to defend ourselves? At what point does it look like we're going to have to amp this thing up using our own resources to a greater degree than what we have today?
I said 3 years for Iraq. ISIL is, and I've also described ISIL in general as a generational problem because of its allure in notably the Sunni sect of Islam. Look, we just have to have a Sunni partner in order to address this challenge of ISIL. And so, although I've said 3 years for Iraq, it's more like a generation, which I suppose is loosely defined as 20 years, to address the violent extremist allure of ISIL in the Sunni world. And that allure will only be stripped away when someone actually takes care of them and governs them. But to your question, are there points at which we should and would consider the introduction of additional U.S. military combat capabilities? The answer is yes. I think you've seen us do that in the raid that we conducted into Syria to capture and kill the group affiliated with Abu Sayyaf, the financial network of ISIL. And I think that we're always on the alert or always on the lookout for those opportunities and can use our capabilities as necessary to deal with those.
You feel that you're in a political appropriate position and that you would have the backing to step in when needed to take care of the problem when the time is right?
If you're asking, I can't answer what answer I would receive. I have the confidence that my recommendation would be accepted and debated in the context of everything else we're doing.
Let me help out here, if I may, Senator. I think that part of our strategy is to look for opportunities to do more in the sense of creating capable ground forces that we can support. So we kind of welcome those opportunities. We're taking those opportunities in the case of Syria. So I don't want to speak for the chairman, but in terms of is the opportunity to do more in that sense, not as a substitute for local people, but as a way of enabling them and assisting them. That really is the strategy. So I think we welcome those opportunities when we find them. We're trying to create those opportunities in the Sunni areas, as was noted earlier. We're taking some opportunities in the Kurdish area, and we hope that we have more, including in Syria.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would make one comment, and that is that it appears to me that if our strategy is waiting on other people to get their stuff in order, it doesn't seem to be as practical as taking advantage of and literally going out and proactively taking care of the problem if need be. And we've got the greatest fighting force in the world, and the last thing in the world I want to see is to have them engage boots on the ground. But if it means boots on the ground or additional folks there, fighting there, as opposed to having a successful attack on this homeland, then I think we all agree on what we ought to be doing. And I just hope that the strategy includes that as a possibility.
Senator Heinrich.
Secretary, Chairman, welcome to you both. Thank you very much for your service. Let me start by saying that surge or no surge, I think it's pretty clear, at least to my constituents, that the Iraq War remains one of the greatest U.S. foreign policy mistakes of the last century, and one that I hope we've learned a few lessons from. I want to follow up, Secretary, on what Senator Hirono raised, and one lesson that I believe we should have learned by now is that eliminating one terrible Middle Eastern dictator can too often lead to even more brutal influences filling the leadership vacuum. We've seen that play out too many times. We've seen it to some extent in both Iraq and Libya. Should we be concerned that in Syria, a post-Assad reality could create a vacuum that ISIL is far better positioned to fill than any of the other regional forces? I'm not sure we should be. I think we should be almost as concerned with forces like al-Nusra Front. And if Assad does fall, shouldn't we have more than discussions on the table? Shouldn't we have a plan to make sure that some amount of governance remains, particularly in Damascus?
Well, yes, we should, and we do. That is our strategy with respect to the political transition. Now, for reasons that are easy to understand, our influence with Bashar Assad, that is U.S. influence, is not great. And so we are trying to influence those who influence him to remove himself from the government of Damascus while keeping intact the structures of governance for the very reason you adduce, which is we know what happens in these Middle Eastern countries when the structures of government disintegrate. And we would like to not see that happen in Syria, even though we know that the persistence of Assad at the helm in Damascus is in fact a fuel for ISIS and others who are fighting him. So he needs to go to remove that fuel, but we don't want to see the structures of governance go at the same time. And that is the challenge, but that's what we're trying to achieve.
Well, I think that's certainly the right goal. I just want to make sure we're prepared for that because we've sort of missed that ball in the past. Syria is an enormous country, and if we saw Damascus lose its governance capability, the implications for the entire region and the world would be enormous. Secretary Carter, as you mentioned as well, to be successful on the ground against ISIL, the fight needs to be led by local, capable ground forces. I don't think we should give in to impatience. These should not be Western forces. These should not be American forces. We've certainly heard that from our partners in places like Jordan. This means that we have to place a great deal of emphasis on training motivated and reliable partners, and you've gone a little bit over the small number of Iraqi security forces recruited, what some of those challenges are, the bottleneck related to the vetting process. But are there other factors that you would attribute for the lack of trainees? And I guess one of the questions I have related to that is, what steps, in addition to the steps that you're taking, what steps is the Iraqi government taking to address this shortfall in order to meet those kinds of training targets we'd like to see?
Thank you, Senator. I think in Iraq, the principal limiting factor on Sunni trainees, which is one of our focuses, has been their belief that the government in Baghdad was not fully supportive of them. That is the challenge before Prime Minister Abadi. He says he wants to do that, and that's critical because only Sunnis can take back Anbar. Only Sunnis can govern Anbar when it's all over. And so if we are going to wrest Anbar from the likes of ISIL, which we must do, we must have Sunnis on our side. And so Abadi is saying all the right things. As the chairman noted, we're trying to support him in doing all the right things. And for us,
so Secretary, I guess I agree with you wholeheartedly in your analysis. I guess my concern is Abadi doing enough to begin to generate confidence in the Sunni population in that region?
I think he is doing everything he personally can. I think he is challenged in Baghdad by others who would have it the old way, the sectarian way. And so he's not able to make everything happen when and as he said, and we've had some delays and some frustration as a result of that. I think things are getting better. We are getting more trainees. It was noted earlier that there is some confidence among Sunni tribes that we will help them train, equip them, support them, and get them back in the fight, and that there's a future for them, not even withstanding the difficulties of multi-sectarian governance in Iraq. That's the path we're on. And in the meantime, just to get back to something that Senator Round said, I think, and I said this before, I just want to restate it, we need to take action to defend ourselves against ISIL, not just in Iraq and Syria, but elsewhere, particularly foreign fighters, even as we defeat them in the place from which they arose. They have metastasized now, they aspire to be a global network, and we have to fight them where they are, and we can't wait for that. We need to do that, and by the way, we do that every day.
Secretary,
we did it this past weekend.
I want to leave you with one last question. It's a very general one. You may have seen the Politico article from a couple of days ago that examined what it called the Daesh effect. And it's sort of a modern example of the ancient proverb that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Whether it's Hamas or al-Nusra or Iran, there are a number of entities that may be enemies of the U.S., certainly enemies of our allies, but are currently share the same opposition to ISIL or Daesh. What are your thoughts on that observation generally, and wouldn't you agree that it's that reality that is part of the reason why this is such a complicated nut to crack?
It is a reason why it's complicated. And again, sectarianism is what brought us to this point. So we are willing to, and we are, and have supported elements of the Iraqi security forces that have a very large Shia composition to them, but if and only if they're under the direction and control of the government of Iraq. And there are Shia forces in Iraq that are not under the direction of control, and we will not support them because that's sectarianism, that sectarian civil war. We know it leads down that road, and we're trying to stop Iraq from going down that road.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary and Chairman, for being with us today. I appreciate your efforts in this area. And Secretary Carter, I'd like to start with you because right now I am very confused. You had stated earlier, and then you affirmed to Senator Ayotte that we are directly arming the Kurds in consultation with the Iraqi government. Would you state that again, please, sir?
Yeah, although I want to, I mean, you're using the word directly, and she used the word directly, and I did too, but let me just be clear about that, which is that we do it in a way that doesn't delay the shipments and doesn't narrow down the shipments at all, but is by, through, and with the government of Iraq. We're sticking with that principle, not because we don't want to help the Kurds and we don't want to help them in a timely way, but because we also want to stick up for the principle of multi-sectarianism. So that is the reason, but we're insistent that it not lead to delays. And as I said, I spoke to Mr. Barzani when he's over here, and I make sure that he's getting the right kind of equipment, not just from us, but the Germans and all the others are arming him in a timely manner. And they are getting that equipment, and they're performing extremely well with it. Let me just see if the chair wants to add anything about the method of arming.
So we are arming the Kurds. It's not being delayed. I know that was stated earlier that there are no significant delays, because I do want to emphasize that, as you know, over the last several months, my colleagues, a number of my colleagues and I have been working on legislation to directly arm the Kurds in consultation with the Iraqi government. And I know that you and Secretary Kerry also had very strongly worded letters to the chairman of this committee emphasizing that we should not be directly arming the Kurds in consultation with the Iraqi government because there were no delays. And yet the president now has come out and said that we will be arming them in an expedited manner. Well, if there were no delays, I don't understand why now we need an additional, several hundred members of our armed services on the ground in Iraq, and that we're expediting the process. If there were no delays, we don't need to be expediting the process. So I just needed to clarify that because it was stated a number of times that we were directly arming the Kurds, which Secretary Kerry had said last year he doesn't have the authority, the president doesn't have the authority to do. I still believe we need to be directly arming them in consultation with the Iraqi government. Following the fall of Ramadi, General Dempsey, you stated that if the Kurds fail to take measures to be more inclusive with Sunnis, Kurds, or other groups, U.S. support for the central government could be curtailed. And, sir, considering the fall of the most western part of Iraq to ISIS, that didn't trigger a decision point on the part of the Iraqi government and its commitment to Iraq, or, I'm just not sure what else the Iraqi government needs to fail at before the administration changes its strategy and how we support our willing partners in Iraq. The Kurdish Peshmerga, they are willing partners, they are, and I think we need to do more for them. We cannot defeat ISIS in Iraq by continuing to beg, hope, and pray that the sectarian Iraqi government, which is still overshadowed, we've heard it a number of times by previous Prime Minister Maliki and Iran, we don't think that they will vigorously defend the Iraqi people equally. I don't believe they will. But we've talked also about being more inclusive. That was mentioned again. More inclusive. I hear this time and time again. But what I would like a definition of what does more inclusive look like, and how do we measure more inclusive? Gentlemen, if you would address that, please.
I would begin by noting the words of Prime Minister Abadi when he was here. I think he used the word decentralized Iraq. And that is one in which there is a central government in Baghdad and an integral state of Iraq. But there is substantial opportunity for self-determination around the country, among Sunnis, among Shias, and among Kurds. And it seems to me that's a wise way of approaching what multi-sectarianism means. I think a government in Baghdad that allows the different parties there a degree of self-determination to maintain security within their own territory and to govern themselves, share in things like the oil wealth of the country and so forth. That is what he says he is for. And that's the way he described it when he was here in Washington to all of that. And that is, in my judgment, certainly better than the alternative, which is sectarian disintegration, which could still occur in Iraq. But I think we all looking into that abyss know what resides there. It's further violence for the citizens of Iraq and further opportunity for groups like ISIL that aren't preoccupied with the long-term welfare of the territories they occupy. They want to use them for further violence. So that is Prime Minister Abadi's definition, and I think we're trying to support him in his aspiration to make good on that definition.
Thank you, General. Anything to add there?
Just to, militarily, what we'll be watching for in terms of the intentions of the government of Iraq and its control over groups that are not directly responsive to the Ministry of Defense is whether there's retribution, whether they allow, it was Tikrit I was speaking about, I think, Senator. As these families come back to Tikrit after it was recaptured, I think we are watching, and it's worth watching, on whether they are able to return to their homes or not. I think the same will be true once Ramadi is recaptured. And we'll probably be watching how the campaign in Fallujah unfolds to ensure that the popular mobilization forces propagate a campaign that's not characterized by retribution and dramatic collateral damage. Those are all things to watch carefully.
I think we have willing partners there. I think we need to assist those willing partners. One further comment, too, just very briefly, is you had stated you haven't seen a request list from the Kurds on the type of equipment and arms that they need. Is that correct?
No, I have seen such requests. We've honored such requests. We've shipped a lot of equipment, and I should once again repeat, it's not just the United States. There are a number of countries that are equipping the Kurds, and in some cases they prefer the equipment of other countries. For example, German anti-tank weapons, and that's absolutely fine with us, and the Germans are providing those.
That is one thing I know that President Barzani had also presented to us during his visit with the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that and that they have provided a list of equipment.
They did. We discussed exactly the same list.
Okay, very good.
And I've discussed it with others who were, for example, the German defense minister I mentioned when I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago. Her commitment to do exactly the same, and they've done a great job of equipping the Kurds. And that's an example of a competent ground force that also governs within the territory that it controls. And that's really what we're looking for in that entire region. It's going to be hard to get, but it's what we're looking for.
Well, they are there, and I know they're willing. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. I have a number of questions and concerns about the ongoing mission against ISIL, which I'll address, but I've got to begin by just saying my concerns about the administration strategy pale next to my concerns about Congress and what Congress is doing. What Congress is supposed to do is to provide a budget to you to defend the nation, and win this battle. And Congress is supposed to authorize a war that is now 11 months in. And we've not done either. We're not giving you a budget. We are using a gimmick, and whether the gimmick is the gimmicks of the past, continuing resolutions, or the current gimmick du jour, which is a use of non-recurring OCO funding, we're not giving you the budget. And we're not doing it because, let's just be blunt, Congress to this point has decided that the budget caps enacted in August of 2011 is a higher national priority than defeating ISIL. And as long as we view that as a higher national priority than defeating ISIL, we're not going to give you the budget that you need. It is my hope, as you testified, Secretary Carter, that we will find a better path, something like a Murray-Ryan budget deal. I know the chair has been significant in speaking out for this as well, but we're not doing what we ought to be doing on the budget side. And we are also not doing what we ought to be doing under Article 1, Section 8, which is declaring war. Tomorrow is the 11th month anniversary of the initiation of the bombing campaign in Sinjar and Erbil. We've spent $3 billion. We've got 3,500 people deployed away from their families, risking their lives. And aside from a single vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in December, there has not been House committee action or floor debate of any significance. There's not been any meaningful debate on the Senate floor about whether or not we should be engaged in this war, even though 3/4 of the members of Congress, by my estimation, believe that there should be U.S. military action against ISIL with some differences in detail. But we don't want to have a debate and vote because we don't want to put our names on it. We don't want to be held accountable for a vote. So we can criticize all we want, and I'll get into some criticisms, but bottom line, Congress is not doing either of the two things we are uniquely supposed to do: provide you a budget to win and authorize war. And that, I think we could make our criticisms have a much greater legitimacy if, as an institution, we would do what we are supposed to do. I just returned from the region, and just some quick summaries. Senator Donnelly mentioned it. We are achieving some significant successes against ISIL in some parts of the battlefield. In Iraq and Syria, largely in the areas where we are relying on partners with the Kurds, the KRG, regional government in Iraq, and then Kurds in the north of Syria. President Barzani, we met him on Sunday in Erbil, I guess 2 Sundays ago, and he said this, and this is very important, especially for any who would say the U.S. doesn't have a strategy. He said, "Thank you to the United States of America. If the president had not started a bombing campaign on August 8th near Erbil, we might not be here today." That bombing campaign likely helped save the existence of the KRG, which has been a good partner. And they lead with that. They don't lead with, "We're not getting weapons." They don't lead with, "We don't like working with Baghdad." They lead with, "Thank you to the United States for helping save us, save our region, save our way of life." And that's important for us to acknowledge, because that wasn't by accident. That's a strategy. We helped save an important ally by acting, the president acting when he did. There are challenges, too. The Iraqi unification challenge was very patent as we met with Prime Minister Abadi. And there's mixed reviews. Positive on the intent, but mixed on the follow-through. In the Sunni area in particular, a lot of criticism. Some support. The Anbar governor supports what Prime Minister Abadi is doing, but a lot of the tribal leaders don't, and a lot of the tribal leaders don't think we're doing what we can do. And when they look at what we're doing with the Kurds and they compare with what we're not doing with them, it sticks in their craw. And finally, the challenges in Syria are significant. Let me ask you this question. Today, front page article in the Washington Post dealing with the routing of ISIL in northern Syria. Quote, "The unexpected rout of Islamic State forces across a wide arc of territory in the northeastern Syria heartland has exposed vulnerabilities in the ranks of the militants and also the limits of the U.S.-led strategy devised to confront them. Islamic State fighters have been driven out of a third of their flagship province of Raqqa in recent weeks by a Kurdish-led force that has emerged as one of the most effective American partners in the war. The offensive, backed by U.S. airstrikes, has deprived the militants of control of their most important border crossing with Turkey and forced them onto the defensive in their self-proclaimed capital of Raqqa City, something that would have been unthinkable as recently as a month ago. That's what's happening right now. But every success has a challenge, and there's a worm in this apple, and the worm is this. As we have succeeded in our partnership with the Kurds in northern Syria, it's caused grave concern by the Turkish government. It's caused grave concern by a number of the other Sunni forces in Syria that we're partnering with. How do we continue to manage the Kurds to be successful in the battle against ISIL and partner with them to be successful without causing additional undue challenges in our effort to also help Sunnis be successful against ISIL?
Thank you, and by the way, thank you once again for traveling there. It's much appreciated. Let me start with the Turks. Turkey has a long common border with both Syria and Iraq, which has remained disturbingly permeable to foreign fighters and to resupply throughout the course of this conflict. And we have some people actually talking to the Turks just today, as the chairman alluded to a while ago, in order to try to get the Turks to up their game. They are a NATO ally. They have a strong stake in things, in stability to their south. I believe they could do more along the border. And so in the meantime, it is true, the Kurds are acting, and because the Kurds are capable of acting, we are supporting them, and that is successful, and it does threaten Raqqa. I think the tension with respect to the Sunnis is best managed in the way that we're hoping Prime Minister Abadi will manage it, namely by letting them each succeed within their own territory, defeat ISIL, and have substantial, his word is decentralization of governance in Iraq that allows them a substantial opportunity to determine their own destiny within the territory that they control. That is what multi-sectarianism in Iraq would mean. As you indicated, it's a lot tougher in Syria, but that's the objective that we have, to have Sunnis. I would like to see the Sunni tribesmen tribal leaders that you met with be as successful as the Kurds are. We would welcome that. That's what we're trying to stimulate in Al-Taqaddum and so forth. And we're willing to do more, as the chairman indicated and I indicated, when we have a capable ground force that we can support the way we did support over the weekend the Kurds in the north with air power.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I also want to just agree with a line of your questioning earlier. I think it would be absolutely foolish for us to not clarify the rules of engagement for the Syrian-trained folks inserted back into the field to make clear that the U.S. will support them if they come under attack by the Assad regime. For them to go back in without a guarantee on that score would seem, we would lose all credibility if we don't provide that. And I just would encourage the administration to clarify that aspect of the rules of engagement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank you, Senator. I have been asking that question for a long time, and I keep getting the answer, well, we haven't made that policy decision. It's shameful, shameful to send people in and not assure them that we will defend them against attacks by barrel bombs. Senator Graham.
Thank you. To build on what we're just talking about, do we have the legal authority to assist the Free Syrian Army that we train against Assad? Is there a doubt about that?
I am not sure about the legalities of it, Senator, to be quite honest. I'm not...
Let's just put it this way. If there's any doubt about whether or not we have the legal authority to protect the troops we train against Assad, please let the committee know. You don't have to answer right now, but that's a big decision. If there's a lack of legal authority, I want to know why and what can we do to fix it.
Appreciate it, and I'll take that back. I appreciate that thought.
Yeah. General Dempsey, thank you for decades of service. I really appreciate that. General Dempsey, would you agree that there are more terrorist organizations with more safe havens, with more weapons, with more capability, with more men to strike the homeland than any time since 9/11?
Thank you for your service. I know you retired recently. Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that ISIL is expanding in other countries as we speak?
Yes.
Okay. When it comes to Iraq, do you both agree that partitioning Iraq into 3 separate countries is probably not a viable strategy?
I certainly agree with that, yes.
Do you agree that the Sunni world would object to giving the southern part of Iraq to Iran? That's what would happen, right, if we partition the South? Do you all agree with that?
Yeah, that sounds like sectarianism to me, and we know what lies down that road.
And independent Kurdistan is going to create a lot of upheaval with Turkey and the region at large. Do you agree with that? A separate independent state.
For the Turks, a separate independent state would be very problematic. And within Iraq, I think a substantial autonomy within a decentralized but integral Iraq is still possible. That's what Abadi's trying to do.
I agree. Do you agree with that, General?
I do, sir.
Yeah, so partitioning, I think, is not a viable strategy. As to the Kurds, do any of you believe, either one of you believe, that the Kurds have the ability, will, to go in to liberate Ramadi?
I'll start that. I think they may have the ability, and we are obviously trying to facilitate their movement south. Whether they have the will is another matter. The only reason that I say that is that they're getting at that point to the edge of the territory that is Kurdish.
Well, that's my point, is for anybody to suggest that the Kurds are the answer to all of our problems, they don't, quite frankly, know the Mideast. I mean, the Kurds are not going to liberate Syria. Do you all agree with that? They'll be part of the component, but they're not going to be the liberating force.
Right, part of the component, absolutely.
As to Assad, what's more likely? President Obama leaves office in 2017, or Assad goes first?
It's certain that President Obama will leave.
Yeah, no, I know that.
And then, so that's an easy question, but then it ends up turning
who's
on
gonna
whether
leave
Assad
first?
will be in power then.
Yeah. Who leaves first, Obama or Assad?
Well, I certainly hope it's Assad.
Yeah, I do, but I don't think so. So the bottom line, if Assad stays in power, do you worry about Jordan and Lebanon being a victim of the war in Syria if it continues the way it's going? That Jordan and Lebanon will become a casualty of the war in Syria?
Well, I think Jordan and Lebanon are already suffering from the effects of war in Syria. They're hosting
we could have
refugees.
right. It could even get worse.
That's exactly the concern we should all have about, one of the concerns we should have about what's going on in Syria. It's not just the Syrian people, it's the neighbors as well.
Do you agree with me that no Arab force is going to go in and fight ISIL alone unless you put Assad on the table?
I see what you're getting at, and it gets back to our train and equip program, and we are finding people who whose principal security fear for their own people, and this is really for their own villages, is ISIL.
Well,
and so they're willing to go and fight against ISIL. There are others who want to fight against Assad,
sure,
and that's it's another matter
here's my point. They're recruiting more foreign fighters than we're training Free Syrian Army. The math doesn't work. This is never going to result in Assad or ISIL being degraded or destroyed. The only way I see ISIL to be degraded or destroyed is for a ground force, regional in nature, to go into Syria. Do you agree with me that no ground force made up of Turks, Saudis, Egyptians, you name it, are going into Syria to fight ISIL unless one of the goals is to replace Assad? They're not going to give half of Syria to Iran.
That sounds sensible to me, and I certainly wish that such a force would be created. I mean, one of the great disappointments in all of this is that the Sunni world more broadly isn't more involved in this fight.
Okay, let's dig into that for a moment. If we went to Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia tomorrow and said, we would like to use your armies, we'll be integrated, would you agree with me for them to say yes, that we would have to make Assad a target of that army? And are we willing to do that?
Let's see. I would guess that it's very hypothetical, because sadly none of them has indicated
Well,
a
here's what
willingness
they've
to do
told
anything
me.
of that kind under any circumstances.
Here's what they've
but
told me.
I see what you're driving
Thank you.
at, which is will the rest of the Sunni Middle East participate in this conflict more? I certainly wish they would. The one answer I know, Senator, is for the Turks. The Turks have stated their position, which is that they definitely want Assad to go, and the conditions for any other participation so far has been that they want to fight against Assad.
Well, I would suggest you do the following, and you travel a lot. We went to Qatar, went to Saudi Arabia, we went all over the Mideast, and they told us to a person, we would gladly join forces with you upon the condition that Assad is part of the target set. And nobody in the United States will tell them whether or not we're willing to take Assad on militarily as part of the ground force. So I would suggest, instead of being upset with the Sunni Arab world, that our problems lie within ourselves, that we're not putting Assad on the table militarily. Do you agree with that? Do you think Assad is on the table militarily?
Senator, as I'm sure you know, his position on the battlefield is more tenuous today than it has been for a long time.
And I don't mean it is, but the point is our efforts designed to take Assad out militarily, or are we focusing just on ISIL?
No, our approach has been, as I think has been stated clearly for some time, to try to find a political exit for Bashar Assad rather than a U.S. led military exit. That is the approach.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank both of you for your decades of service, and that includes you, Mr. Secretary, because you have given decades. I want to follow up on that line of questioning. So if Assad exited tomorrow, what would be the likely strategy that we would use going forward?
Our strategy would be to encourage the moderate opposition to partner with the structures of the government of Damascus, not directly associated with Assad or with his deplorable behavior, and I think we can determine what that is, keep the structures of government in place, unify with the moderate Syrian opposition, and create a new government which is more reflective of the aspirations of the populace than Assad's is, and then they would in turn need to go and reclaim their territory from ISIL, and I think the United States and the rest of the international coalition would be pleased to support them in that.
And does Assad exiting sooner rather than later, does that create conditions that are so chaotic for the interests of the United States, or is the interest of the United States in him leaving sooner than later?
I think sooner, and in a way, as I indicated, that the reason for, to get back to the earlier line of questioning, for a political rather than a military transition, for us to support and seek that, is that it is less disruptive, less chaotic, less sparks sectarianism and therefore violence. That's why it's much to be preferred over a simple toppling of Assad, because you don't know what's on the other side of a simple toppling of Assad. So I know it's unsatisfying to talk about a political transition when he himself gives very little indication of wanting to do that. But that is much to be preferred if we can have that. Otherwise, we know what happens when these countries disintegrate.
And were a political solution to be found for his exit, which of course is going to be difficult with Iran being his mentor, but Vladimir Putin could be instrumental in arranging some kind of exit strategy. But were it to be a political solution, do you think it reasonable that there would be some accommodation so that the Alawite minority would not be slaughtered?
I think there has to be that ingredient. I mean, first of all, the Alawite community will fight for the territory in the Northwest, but once again, that's just further conflict, further civil war, and ethnic cleansing of any kind is the kind of thing you could see on the other side of a collapse there, and we know how tragic that is for people.
What would his arranged exit do with regard to Hezbollah, and will they resist it the whole way?
Hezbollah has been one of the principal supporters of the Assad regime, so they do not give any indication of welcoming the path that we're discussing here. The Russians, perhaps, and I know that we've been in contact with the Russians about that over the years, and certainly I think that they would, if they threw their weight behind such a transition, be influential with Assad. And so I certainly hope they would, but I have no confidence as I sit here right now that they will.
Mr. Secretary, when you look at a map like this, a map of Syria that I assume you handed out, somebody did, that's a mess. And maybe it is the only solution, is the solution of a political exit for Assad, so that we can go after these extremist elements. By the way, I had to leave the committee to do an interview on CNN, and the whole focus that they wanted to jump on was your statement earlier in the hearing that we had only trained up 60. But I pointed out to them what you said was the vetting is very difficult, and in fact, we are vetting several thousands additional, and the vetting is a lot more torturous because you certainly don't want to have a guy trained up and then he turns around and aims his gun back at us. In Iraq, do you think that this new prime minister has the capability of getting out of his Shiite mold? And does he have the capability of bringing in all the Shiites with all of the Iranian influence in his government in order to reach out with an olive branch to the Sunnis?
Thank you. And with respect to the first part of your remarks, I'm always going to be truthful with you. And the number is 60. And I think we've stated that number before, but I said it today, and I'll always tell the truth. And that is a small class. It results from the fact that that is the number that got through the very rigorous vetting and selection process we have. The General Nagata, who runs that program, believes that he has learned a lot. He has 7,000 behind that, so I expect those numbers to increase. But I wanted to tell the truth, and I did tell the truth. We expect that number to improve, but you deserve to know where things stand, and I'm telling you where things stand. And with respect to Abadi, there I'd say also that he has indicated to us, and he's here in Washington, I believe he spoke to many of you as well, his intention to proceed in a way that is distinctly different from the way his predecessor proceeded, and which led to the situation we now have in Iraq. We're certainly supporting him in that regard, but one can see that his intentions are contested in Baghdad. And so we continue to support him. We continue to think, to get back to the earlier line of question, that a multi-sectarian future for Iraq is the best for stability and peace and the best for the defeat of ISIL. But he will have some substantial influence over that, but it's clear he doesn't have absolute control in Baghdad. We are supporting him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Secretary Carter and General Dempsey, for being here today. And General Dempsey, I especially want to thank you for your decades of service to your country and to the cause of freedom. We wish you the best of luck in your future endeavors, and I'm not sure whether this will be the last time we're privileged to speak with you in a hearing, but regardless, please know how much we appreciate all you've done for our country. And I want, although they've not been labeled combat troops, they're still operating under dangerous and uncertain circumstances and are far removed from their families and from the people they love. I want to follow up on the discussion between Senator McCain and Secretary Carter on how we might support Syrian rebels once they return from training. Mr. Secretary, you stated that you believe we have an obligation to those we train to provide them with protection, and I agree with that. And I also believe we have an obligation to let the American people know, and that you have an obligation to let Congress know and help us to fully understand what this strategy entails, what that means, and the funding, the time, and the effort that providing any such protection might entail, and what it will necessitate. So can you tell us, when will the Department of Defense fully explain to the American people and to Congress what this strategy will involve, what it's going to cost our government? I've said this before, but this is something that should have been made clear last year when the President came up with this plan. But regardless, it's better late than never. It's good that we do it now rather than not at all. Can you tell us when that might occur?
I'll continuously tell you what's going on over there with respect to what we're doing in Iraq and what we're doing with respect to Syria. And we're going to have to, as I said, I think we have an obligation to support those fighters when they go in there. We're going to have to decide exactly under what conditions and what way we'll make that tactical decision when we introduce them. But I think the main thing is that we increase that number from what is now a very small number, and I'm not surprised that it's running on television, into a much larger number. I think we can do that, and the officer who runs this program believes that he will be able to do that, and we'll keep you apprised of our progress, and I'll tell you every day what I know, as I've done here today.
Thank you. I appreciate that and look forward to that. Now, U.S. strategy in Syria is to empower the quote-unquote moderate opposition to defeat ISIS and to put enough pressure on the Assad regime to achieve some type of negotiated peace settlement. For the sake of discussion, let's say that these moderates are successful in degrading ISIS to the point that they're no longer a factor in Syria.
What does pressuring Assad or his supporters into a negotiated settlement look like at that point, especially given the military support from Iran and Hezbollah that they currently enjoy? Specifically, what role will the United States play in bringing about the pressure and support to achieve this kind of settlement?
I think the way it would look, the outcome that we are aiming for, is one in which Bashar al-Assad and those who have been associated with his atrocities in Syria are removed, but the structures of government in Damascus and in Iraq that remain continue on, are in an inclusively governed way that is multi-sectarian, to include Alawites and others, and that can then turn to the task of regaining its sovereign territory from ISIL to the east in a project that would look like what we are working with Baghdad to accomplish to its west in Iraq. That is the post-Assad transition that would be the best for the Syrian people and the best for our counter-ISIL strategy.
By the way, do you believe the 2001 authorization for the use of military force gives authority necessary to engage the Assad regime forces that may come into conflict with any rebels we may train?
I'm going to be very careful about how I answer a legal question in that regard, and I'd prefer to get back to you in that regard.
Okay. Now, Mr. Secretary, what level of command and control, in your opinion, does ISIS leadership have over these various affiliate groups across the Middle East and Northern Africa, as well as lone wolf individuals or groups in Europe and the Western Hemisphere?
It's mixed, but in the main, not entirely, but in the main, what one sees is a mixture of groups that were already radicalized and already intent upon attacking the West or attacking Western interests or destabilizing places in the Middle East, rebranding themselves as ISIL because of this seeming success it had. And then to get to the lone wolf part, you see people who have had no training, no association with it, including Americans, who go on the internet and find themselves enthralled because whatever lost souls they are, enthralled by the violence or whatever associated with ISIL, and self-radicalize and unfortunately undertake to do violence. So you see that spectrum there. You do see some effort by ISIL, meaning ISIL in Syria and Iraq, to command and control, but it's not exclusively that way. And I say all this because that's very distinctly different from the al-Qaeda model. The al-Qaeda model was a very hierarchical, very clear command and control type terrorist enemy. And that meant they had discipline, and it meant they could take on big things like 9/11. But it also meant that when we started to go after them, they were vulnerable to attacks on the command and control structure and on their logistic structure. ISIL is more resilient because it is more decentralized and informal in that sense. It takes a different kind of campaign. We're highly aware of that, as is law enforcement, by the way.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman McCain asked that I recognize Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to this country, and I especially want to thank you, General Dempsey, for the many, many years that you have served the people of this country and the military families that have been under you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Carter, earlier Senator Rounds had a conversation with General Dempsey about the act of patience and time, and I know the General's counseled patience, and he has discussed time. What role do you see time playing in our strategy. You know, do we have a strategy on forces, on containing ISIL? Are we going to allow them to be able to maintain control of territory for the next 3 to 5 years? Is that going to be acceptable to us? And do you see risks with that type of strategy?
Well, I think we're going to continue to strike and apply pressure to ISIL throughout this period. We're doing it now. We do it every day. It's had some effect. And we're going to continue every single day, as we did over this past weekend, to defend ourselves against ISIL, including these homegrown people. All that will go on and has to go on because we have to protect ourselves in the meantime. What takes the time, and I think this is what the chairman was getting at, what takes the time is, and this is just in the nature of things, getting a lasting result. A lasting result is one where not only is ISIL defeated, but they stay defeated. And in order for them to stay defeated, there has to be somebody on that territory who is keeping the peace and governing and replacing the ISIL in the territory. And that takes some time. We see ourselves, we're
managing that risk, and you look at balancing it, how do you reach a decision where you can maintain that patience when you know that when ISIL controls that territory that they have now and they continue to advance in other areas, whether it would be in the region or in Russia, that is recruitment item for them, that it will inspire attacks, whether it's in that region or elsewhere around the world. How do you balance that and have the risk that we face in our homeland continue, what I think would be continue to grow because of possibly an overabundance of patients?
Yeah, I'll keep at it because, as I said, this is the issue on which the campaign turns, correctly, or correct? So what you have to be assured of is that as we manage risk, we look at those things which could threaten U.S. persons and facilities around the globe and the homeland. And where we see risk accruing that could have threatened that national security interest, there's no hesitance for us to act unilaterally and decisively. On the other hand, this campaign is built on the premise that it relies upon other actors. That necessarily requires a degree of patience that we need to nurture, we need to reinforce, and we need to understand in the context of the other things we're trying to accomplish, not only in the Middle East, but globally. So if you're suggesting that ISIL's threat to the homeland could increase because of this patience. I concede that risk. We take on board the responsibility to manage it. But I would also suggest to you that we would contribute mightily to ISIL's message as a movement were we to confront them directly on the ground in Iraq and Syria.
If we look at patience, if we look at restraint, don't you think that with our restraint, we're in many ways encouraging the Iraqis to look elsewhere and to especially look to Iran and invite them into Iraq where they are, because they know that that Iran will be there fighting a common enemy that they both face at this point? Aren't we opening that door to Iran with this, what I kind of view as an overabundance of patience, which to me is the greatest risk?
Yeah, look, when you look at what we're doing, we're trying to, by the way, the government of Iran has been reaching out to Iran since roughly 2004, and they have probably increased their outreach to Iran, but it has very little to do with what we're doing or not doing. It has everything to do with the fact that they believe that their future is, that it's their turn, and that their particular form of governance, which is not yet inclusive as it needs to be, is the right form of governance. So they were going to do this whether we're there or not, and whatever manner in which we exert our influence.
So they have boots on the ground in Iraq through no action of the United States or inaction by the United States.
I would say that they're the advisors that have been sent, the ISR that they're flying, and some of the other capabilities they provided to the government of Iraq, I would agree with you that they would have provided that whether we were there.
It was a question, it wasn't a statement on my part.
The answer is, yeah, they would have been there regardless of our actions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for the testimony today. General Dempsey, I want to join my colleagues in commending you for your decades of service, and Secretary Carter, it's good getting caught up last week. Appreciate your outstanding service as well to our country. You know, there's been a lot of criticism of the president when he, in August 2014, and then just a couple weeks ago at the G7 meeting, talked about how we don't have a strategy yet with regard to ISIS. He said that in 2014. He again said it again just a couple weeks ago. But what he really has not been criticized for, and I think is something that I'd like to get your view on, is each time he's talked about the lack of a strategy, he's essentially kind of put it on your plate. Each time he's said, well, the guys at the Department of Defense are kind of coming up with options, still haven't gotten them yet. DOD's working this. Literally said that, a version of that in August of 2014 and in June of 2015. Did it take the Department of Defense a year to come up with a strategy to defeat ISIS?
I'll take start of that. First of all, thank you for your conversation. Thanks for everything you're doing, especially with respect to our Asia-Pacific strategy, Senator. Very grateful for that and your travels there and your leadership. We just spoke yesterday at the Pentagon with the president about his strategy, and the strategy is the one that
you've laid out.
I described today.
Okay, so he can't.
By the way, he described 8 or 9 months ago, and that doesn't. And this is important. It involves us, and we have an important role.
Right.
But it involves other parts of the government as well. That's one of the reasons to keep laboriously citing 9 lines of effort. There really are 9 lines of effort. You know, we don't directly, for example, try to interdict self-radicalized Americans.
Yeah.
The FBI does that. We don't do that, but we've got to do that while we're working on these difficult problems of Iraq.
No, Mr. Secretary, I agree 100% with that, and that's why, to me, again, it was a little bit and maybe you just can't answer the question directly, I wish you would, but the fact that the president, it just goes to some of the process here. The fact that the president for years has essentially been saying, we don't have a strategy, and it's because the guys over at DOD still haven't given me one, to me is not, it's not how we develop strategy, as you just mentioned. This strategy needs to be all instruments of American power. The military is clearly one, but we need economic, energy, finance, diplomatic, the whole list. And that, of course, has to be developed by the White House, not by the Department of Defense. So I don't think it took a year for the Pentagon to come up with a strategy. And despite the fact that the president, each time he said we don't have a strategy, said that it was essentially your fault. I don't think it was your fault. I think it was the White House's fault. And I just want to be on record saying that I think that's unfair criticism to be put at the chairman or the secretary to say, we don't have a strategy yet, and it's because DOD. But I guess he now can say we do have a strategy. Is this the strategy?
This is the strategy, and it is devised by the president and the White House. We play a role in it.
Right.
So I did not observe any waiting for us to come up with a strategy.
Well, he actually said it twice.
The strategy that I've described, the 9 lines of effort, was, I think, first described the end of last summer. It makes common sense that our strategy has all the parts that the 9 lines of effort describe. Yesterday's meeting was to give him an update and to get his guidance on how we go forward. We did that. It wasn't just, it happened to be at the Pentagon, and the focus was on the 2 of the 9 lines of effort that we're responsible for, but there were other members of the national security community, which is essential to this, who were present and participated in that discussion. And so the
okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, you don't have to answer this, but I don't assume it took a year for the military to come up with options for the president. But
well, no, I'd be happy to answer it because we're frequently and constantly adapting options. But the context of when he said that was he had asked us, is there something more we need to be doing with the Sunni tribes? That's the context of the question. So the real issue is whether we should be doing more with the Sunni tribes, and the outcome of that conversation and the planning that went into it was the Taqadum Air Base Train, Advise, and Assist platform.
thank you. Let me turn, I know there's been some discussion with regard to the NDAA, and I think it's a good bill, very bipartisan bill. Senator Reid and Chairman McCain should be commended for the great work they did. One of the things that we try and do in the bill in a number of areas is bolster the credibility where the United States is seen as having a strategy both supported by the executive branch and the legislative branch. And some of us think that our credibility in certain areas of the world has been weak, and it's been one of the weaknesses of our national security and foreign policy strategy. But we tried to do that in a number of areas, and I just want to provide 2 examples. You kind of hinted at one, Mr. Secretary, the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific. There's some strong language in there about the support for that from the Congress, very bipartisan, and how we need to be increasing troops in the Asia-Pacific. Also very much a focus that I think is an area that, Mr. Secretary, you said we're late in the game in the Arctic. And you may have seen, if you haven't, I would recommend you take a look at it. The Newsweek this week talks about cover story on the Arctic. The title is actually, "In the Race to Control the Arctic, the U.S. Lags Behind." It talks about how this is developing as the new great game, and Kipling's famous phrase about a critical strategic area, how the Russians are very, very involved in the Arctic. Mr. Chairman, you actually in testimony from this committee talked about the 4 new combat brigades, that they're standing up a new Arctic brigade, their exercise in the last couple months. And then the comment on the Coast Guard is essentially saying it's a new geopolitical Cold War the U.S. is in danger of losing. We're not even playing in this game at all. So I just wanted to ask a final comment, Mr. Chairman. You talked about managing risks, Mr. Chairman. Would removing our only airborne brigade, BCT, in the Arctic, our only BCT in the Asia-Pacific, what would that do to our credibility? Would that bolster our credibility in the Arctic or Asia Pacific with regard to the rebalance? And you talked about managing risk. Certainly seems to me as Vladimir Putin is militarizing this part of the world, if we're actually removing forces, our only Arctic trained forces, that's a way to increase risk, because we know he views weakness as being provocative. They're making a move in the Arctic. If we start withdrawing troops, the 425 in particular, I think that heightens risk. Would either you care to comment on that?
Yes, I think it increases risk, but some of the decisions, and you're talking about the Army in this case, but some of the choices that the service chiefs are going to have to make as we continue to go down in terms of resources. You know, the Army is tasked with going from 490,000 active where they are today to 450 in the next 2 years, and they got to come from someplace. And
but to put that BCT on the block first, to me, is a inviting, A, the Congress is saying don't do it in the NDAA, but secondly, that's going to undermine our credibility, not only in the Arctic, it's going to undermine our rebalance to the Asia-Pacific strategy. Those are PACOM forces.
I'm not going to predispose the Army's decision, although it sounds like you may already have some insight.
No, I don't. I'm just making
Okay,
sure the Army doesn't make a strategic
right.
blunder.
Although we are, I will tell you this, Senator, we are familiar with the Congress telling us no on the reforms that we're making, not because we're trying to cut ourselves apart, but because we've got $1 trillion, that's a T, not a B, $1 trillion less in budget authority over 10 years. We've said from the beginning, it's a disaster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just do want to mention that if we're looking at BCTs going to the area where the Congress has actually said we need to increase forces, having our only Asia-Pacific Arctic capability, which, as you know, General, you can't develop overnight, and our only airborne capability in the entire Asia-Pacific, to me, that would be a strategic blunder. And I think Congress sometimes comes in and has broader strategic insights than the military has on occasion, not always. But in my view, this time is one of them.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, let me thank you for your testimony, and I personally want to thank you for your service to the nation, both of you, particularly General Dempsey, as you conclude your uniform service. And again, with Chairman McCain's direction, I will adjourn the hearing. Thank you.